Hello.
Hello. Oh,
How you doing today?
doing excellent. Thank you for asking. I'm excited.
Oh, you are. Oh, yeah, yeah. Because one of these videos is one that you've been wanting to do for a long time, huh?
Yeah, and just in general, I'm a really big fan of JJ McCullough. I think he's pretty underrated, although he's had some pretty explosive growth in the past year or so, at least in the circles I've been in. So I'm very happy about that.
Okay, yeah, I'm not very familiar with him at all, but it like just from the titles of the videos, I'm inferring that he's kind of commenting on our political culture generally. Is that kind of
Mhm.
roughly the gist of what his channel is?
Yeah, he had this great video describing where he envisions his channel as being an unleft space, not an anti-left space or pro-left space, but a space that isn't, he has this video. In the video he describes it, he sort of has these two thumbnails for YouTube videos, and in one of them it's like this, like, bisexual lighting, and it's Doctor Who and Neocolonialism, Part 12. And then the other one is like a city in flames and a picture of Biden falling asleep, and it's like senile Biden destroys Democrat midterm hopes. And he was like, I really don't like this dynamic. I sort of hope to escape it and just do generic stuff. My understanding of his background is that he was a political pundit, sort of like a talk show person on Canadian TV, who sort of went around and he still is a journalist, I believe, for the Washington Post, writing sort of center right Canadian, a sort of center right perspective on Canadian politics. But his channel focuses a lot on sort of not politics itself, but sort of just a lot more of cultural identity stuff. So he'll have a lot of videos on like the history of Canada or like the history of like specific cultural things. He likes to do a lot of cultural analysis. And then he does still have the occasional dash of sort of politics, but it's usually pretty more moderate analysis and sort of descriptions as opposed to, anything like, like real like partisan or divisive coverage of specific events.
All right. Well, oh, oops, sorry, muted. All right. Well, that sounds interesting. So we've got three short videos that we're going to go over today, as opposed to our usual hour-long documentaries or whatever. So
Yeah.
I'm ready to get started whenever you are.
Just remember to go live here on Discord. All right, so the first one is Ben Shapiro and the Tragedy of Political Commentary. I think just sort of a preamble before we get into this. Ben Shapiro is someone, you know, I just feel like there's such a greater potential for Ben Shapiro than what Ben Shapiro does. Ben Shapiro is someone, I mean, I at least have a lot of disagreements with him on policy, but he's the kind of conservative where I feel like, oh, agree to disagree. That's okay, right? Ben Shapiro's not out here, generally speaking, on some crazy shit. Unlike a lot of the people that work at his own company. I don't know if you ever saw the election night coverage in 2020 on Daily Wire, but it was wild watching Ben Shapiro being like, wow, looks like it's turning for the Democrats. I guess we'll need to wait to see the results. And everyone else that he worked from is like, they're stealing it. And Ben's like, where's the evidence? Ben Shapiro is like, I think, like, is someone I really hope that is going to be like part of the movement of sane conservatives to take back over the Republican Party. And I feel really conflicted because on the one hand, I really want him to be like almost like a destiny figure where he goes to war, right? I want to see Ben Shapiro go on the righty arc, equivalent to Destiny's lefty arc, where he's like tearing people apart, and just being incredibly divisive. But there's also a part of me that understands, Ben is, Ben there's a part of me that wonders if Ben Shapiro is almost, doing the, is doing the sort of idea of someone sane needs to stay on board, so I'm not going to rock the boat here. Because if I stand up and rock the boat, I'm just going to get removed, and I'll get replaced by someone who isn't sane. So yeah, it's someone that I really have a lot of respect for him in terms of his ability to argue, and I think he's a really smart guy. But I feel really conflicted about his role in the development of like what conservative politics looks like in America.
Yeah, on the rocking the boat point, I sort of feel like there's some optimal amount of rocking the boat where if you don't do it at all, then you're just wasting an opportunity. But then if you do it too much, then yeah, you get thrown out of the movement. You
Yeah,
lose your
it's tough.
influence. Yeah.
Anyways,
So a few months ago,
oh
noted
my goodness, that was really loud. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah, no problem.
commentator Ben Shapiro had a rather
Can you turn it like slightly louder than that, but quieter than before?
Let's watch a clip.
Okay,
As you
good,
say
perfect,
in your
thank you.
book, you say that there's quite a key phrase: "We are so angry at each other right now." But as I say, aren't you part of that anger? Aren't you encouraging that anger? For example, you described Mr. Obama's State of the Union address in 2012 as fascist mentality in action.
Well, I think that if you want to argue with the characterization, then we can talk about what exactly his State of the Union address said.
Plenty of things are bad and wrong, but it doesn't make them fascist.
Well, I suppose that's true.
You said they should
Correct.
turn their badge in as a Jew.
Yes, I believe that if you are somebody who takes Judaism seriously, that comes along with ideological commitment.
I mean, I guess...
Also, I hope you're having fun, by the way, going through every old tweet that I've ever sent to try and do gotcha questions.
Well, you said
Sure.
Israelis like to build, Arabs like to bomb crap and live in open sewage.
Well,
Not a
as I
good
say
tweet.
in an article entitled, here's a list of all the giant, bad, dumb things I've ever said.
Was that
list
dumb?
includes... What? Yes, that's a dumb tweet. Frankly, I find this whole thing a waste of time. If you want to read the book and critique the book, why don't you read and critique the book? If you want to critique me, you can think whatever you want of me.
Why don't you just
frankly,
try and
I don't
answer
care.
the
I don't
questions?
frankly give a damn what you think of me since I've never heard of you.
Now, in fairness to Ben, I don't think the interviewer did a particularly good job here. I don't think it's that fun or useful to the audience when the host just spends like 15 straight minutes trying to get the guest to justify the worst things he's ever said. It makes the whole thing seem less like an interview and more like a trial. And as anyone...
Yeah, I think when it comes to having done bad things, if people are willing to own up to their mistakes, then I really do think that time heals all wounds. It's not the case if you don't own up to it, and that's something I feel really conflicted about. Someone like Joy Reid, for example. Man, I kind of think Joy Reid should not have a job because those homophobic blog posts that she made all those years ago, she still to this day denies and never apologized, never owned up to it, even though I don't really think it's that big of a deal. But with the Ben stuff, he has opened up and said that, those were mistakes, so I don't think it's very good. That being said, his conduct in the interview also wasn't very good. I don't know if you watched the Lex Friedman podcast he did with Ben Shapiro recently, but there was a whole segment talking about that, and Ben said, he really did not realize that British interviews on the British media are by default a lot more hostile, so he sort of got blindsided by that, and he had no idea that, I don't remember that guy's name. I believe it's Neil something. Is actually quite famous for giving really tough interviews. So he just really got blindsided by that. But I do fundamentally agree. I don't think it's fair to start dragging up all these tweets when it's something that they've already apologized for. Although equally, Ben should just go, yeah, that's bad, and move on. So it's a lot of blame to go around.
What do you think of that style of interviewing? Do you think it's better to be more confrontational like they are in Britain?
I certainly like... I'd rather err on the side of more confrontation than less, but there's definitely a point where there is too much confrontation, and I think in that interview it did go over the line, especially because the things he was being very confrontational about are mistakes that Ben Shapiro has owned up to that are very old, right? Like, if it was the case that it was a recent controversy and Ben Shapiro had apologized, then I think it's still fair. It's like, okay, this is all fresh. But I think that Arabs live in sewage tweet, which is an awful, horribly racist tweet. I think that's from 2014 or something, like almost 10 years old, and Ben Shapiro's apology for it as well, I think, was at this point 4 or 5 years old as well. So I think at that point it's like, okay, dude, damn, you got me. 10 years ago I said some fucked up shit, and 5 years ago I apologized for it. I'm incredible own.
That makes me think that the point about rocking the boat probably applies to the interviewer as well, right? There's some optimal amount of rapport that you want to maintain with your interview subject while also being able to challenge them.
Yeah, it's actually it's such a good way of thinking about it, because it's the exact same thing, And this interview he rocked the boat too much, and so he got jettisoned. So there's no progress to be made anymore.
Yeah. In general, I my impulse is to say that the British way of doing it is maybe a little better than the average American softball interview, but yeah, I can see how they've got to be at least a little bit cautious with how confrontational they get.
Yeah.
Who has ever been to court will tell you trials are boring. But I do think that this episode was an interesting one insofar as it revealed something about the often inherently tragic nature of the professional political commentator. And I know firsthand
Did he just say
all about this
about?
because
That's very
political
Canadian.
commentator has been my own job for the last 10 years or so. Before we go any further, I just wanted to let you know that today's video was brought to you by Blinkist. Blinkist is a very cool app that provides you with condensed, audible, or written summaries of the most popular non-fiction books on the market. It is a very cool sponsor that I will tell you more about in a bit. So by the time I graduated high school, I was pretty convinced that I wanted to grow up to be one of those guys who shares his political opinions for a living, both in print and on TV. In other words, a political pundit. This is a relatively new sort of work, a job that is a product of a sort of late 20th century philosophy of journalism, a philosophy that argues there should be two distinct classes of journalists, reporters and commentators. The reporters are the unbiased people who just tell you the news as calm and neutrally as possible, while the commentators, or pundits, are the people who analyze the news for you. They can be as biased as they want because it is always made very clear that they are just speaking from their own personal perspective. Pundits are useful employees for news organizations for a number of reasons. By analyzing the news rather than just reporting it, pundits are able to help the audience make various subjective assessments about news stories and events. Assessments like, is this story a big deal or not? How should we feel about it? Happy, sad, outraged, or what? How can this story help us make useful predictions for the future? Should this story motivate us to act any particular way in response to it? And of course, pundits help make the news more lively and entertaining. When you are unbiased, you have to be rather stiff and formal all the time. Whereas when you're free to express an opinion, you can be more funny or combative or thoughtful, and that's more fun to watch or read. I've had a fairly conventional pundit career up here in Canada. I've written hundreds of opinion columns for newspapers and magazines and news websites, and made tons of regular appearances on TV shows to talk about what I think. I don't really do as much of this anymore because I'm now pretty YouTube-centric, but I am still a weekly columnist at the Washington Post. Being a professional pundit is a very flattering, very empowering existence. Being paid to share your opinions with the world can make you feel like a real big shot, because it means that someone out there has made an assessment that your opinions are inherently valuable. If you're someone who just generally likes to write and think and talk, it can seem like a real dream job. But of course, at the end of the day, it is still a job. People who run newspapers and TV stations and websites won't just hire any old self-important rando to talk about the news. They're generally looking for people with a few key characteristics. Number one,
unlike Twitch, where we get to be self-important randos all by ourselves.
Clearly and assertively. No stage fright.
It's funny though, because I think a lot of what he's going to get into here is very true of the selection process for Twitch. You know, anyone can sign up to be in Twitch politics, but the traits that select for people rising to the top, I think actually have a lot of parallels here. It's something that I find really interesting because you would apply a lot of his analysis, which I don't think he realizes, directly applies to, I think, a lot of the Twitch politics scene.
Right, or being too timid to express a strong opinion in public. Number two, generalized knowledge. When you are working as a professional pundit, the expectation is that you will be able to speak confidently about anything that makes it into the news, even if it is not something that you are personally interested in all that much. Your job is to be up to date and well informed on basically everything. I remember when I was working at Sun TV, I would be doing multiple segments a day on everything from the casting of the new James Bond to changes to the Ontario welfare system. I didn't naturally have strong opinions on a lot of the stuff I was made to talk about, so often I would just sort of have to force myself to. Number three, consistent worldview. Producers and editors like to know what they're getting from a pundit because
can we pause for a second?
It's easier for them to fit that.
Yeah.
I kind of want to dwell a little more on his previous point, the idea that in order to be interesting in punditry, you kind of have to form strong opinions on things that that you may not actually feel strong about, and there, I think there's kind of a selection pressure for that for people who are willing to, I don't know, to speak either like over confidently or over dramatically about things where they maybe the better response is to go, well, I don't know.
Yeah, I 100% agree. That is such a big problem, not just in punditry, but in general. It feels like people are very unwilling to strongly put forward. People need to be willing to put forward the opinion of, I'm not sure, as strongly as they put forward the position, I am sure. But there's a real selection process where the people who speak the loudest are going to be the ones that are most confident of a certainty. But you can still be confident of an uncertainty. You can be very confident that we don't know. And those positions tend not to be made as forcefully. And so there's a real problem that, like, the smallest voices are often the loudest. Sort of the idea that the discussion gets dominated by a couple voices that may not actually be representative of what a lot of people believe, because there might be a lot of people that are uncertain, and those people are going to be a lot more quiet.
Yeah, and this is also parallel to Twitch, by the way. But yeah, it's like, because there are certain types of opinions and certain ways of expressing those that are more likely to capture an audience and more likely to retain an audience. And what the audience is usually not there for is like radical skepticism and like, you know, probabilistic inferences about the data. Like, they're really more in it to just, I don't know, see opinionated people yelling at each other most of the time.
Yeah, and in terms of forcing us to opinion, I mean, I felt that pressure before in Twitch panels too. I mean, I think probably one of my most infamous Twitch panel appearances, I think it was one that got reviewed by like Chud Logic and stuff, was I was on some Wick panel talking about social media, and I was like, you know what, we're all sort of all talking around in a circle here. What if we had like a Big Brother social media that could restrict our social media access? We're being mentally ill. And I was upfront that, you know, it was a hot take. I mean, yeah, we literally have a term for this, like something sort of off the cuff. A lot of the times these hot takes come from like, the conversation's getting a little boring. You know, let's throw some spice in there. Yeah, man, that happens all the fucking time. I guess just speaking more personally, one thing I am constantly worrying about is that when you sort of amp up on these opinions that you are just sort of like, you're just sort of forcing yourself to find that there's a great capacity in the human body or the human mind for self-delusion. You know, that was a take that I 100% just made up on the spot, just thinking. Like, but like, the arguments I was making were genuine. And days later, I was like, you know what? I don't think this is viable, but I still think I'm fundamentally right about the points. And there's this constant battle I have in my head. It's like, okay, I 100% know I made this up on the spot. So is it really the case that I'm actually correct about this, or I'm just really like fooling myself and potentially others that agree with me? That I think that crisis of like external validators is something that is really dangerous for like people who want to like be pundits, be it like in real media or in Twitch politics, because you're going to be selecting for someone that is really good at making arguments that are convincing. So there's a real worry, I think, sometimes that you can be deluding yourself, and even that people outside that are agreeing with you have themselves been fooled by you. I worry about that all the time.
Yeah, I think you're kind of an interesting example of this, because I think you're generally really good about not being like spicy just for the sake of spiciness, and you're usually pretty good about like, you know, caveating your statements responsibly, and yet if one of the things that you're best remembered for is like one of your most irresponsible moments, then like there's that exact selection pressure at work, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be either that panel or probably the Destiny panel, the panel that got Destiny banned that I was on, which I will never live down for all my days.
I'm interested in what you'd have to say about that, because you know, having been there myself, I didn't walk away from that thinking that you were particularly spicy on it.
Yeah, ultimately, you know, I was arguing against Destiny, but I was nowhere near the craziest person on there, and I think I was giving some pretty reasonable
you were
takes.
probably like the most centrist person on there. I thought.
The trans sports question is really hard. It doesn't seem like there are any good answers. And so I guess my sort of sheepish defense would be that, you know, I'm trying to figure out what the best solutions are. And in that particular scenario, I was looking at the downsides of Destiny's solution. Although I think it's one that I actually do broadly agree with. Like, I actually think that for high level competitions, collegiate and above, I think I actually don't believe that just by virtue of trans people going through hormone therapy, that they should be able to compete in those. But sorry, not to get into the actual details of that argument, because that's not what matters. My engagement in that panel, I think, is more emblematic of sort of the dangers, or is more emblematic of this phenomena that JJ's talking about, where when you're in that panel, especially, you know, it's going through my head, oh my god, I'm on a panel with Destiny, I gotta say something, I don't want to just sit here, man, I want to use the opportunity, and that led me astray, and I ended up making some arguments that, when I look back, were just really, really dumb. So I think it's just a matter of you've got to just plant your flag and not waver, because those social pressures are huge, right? It's very similar. It's no different than when you're in a group, and everyone's laughing along with a joke. A lot of times you'll laugh along with a joke that you don't even understand, and you're like, oh, it's like it kills you inside, like, oh God, why am I doing this? You're like, okay, just move on. I don't want to. It kills you even more to be like, I don't get it. I don't get the joke, or be the one guy that isn't laughing.
Yeah. So I realized while you were in the middle of saying that you were talking about the panel that you were on with Destiny about the transports thing.
Yes.
Like what I thought I was asking about was the panel shortly after Destiny's ban, where it was like Vivian and Pisco yelling at each other the whole time. But you were on there.
There were a bunch of those. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I think there were like 2 or 3 of those panels. Those were that was a wild arc.
That person into some larger content strategy. So for example, a newspaper might hire a liberal columnist because they already have a conservative one and they think it's important for there to be balance. Or a TV segment producer might want to have a guest who has very strong opinions on free trade because that's also the opinion of the host. So while it's important to be able to analyze just about anything that happens in the world, it is also very useful if your opinions can be sort of broadly consistent and predictable. If your view
That's another thing that JJ's mentioned in here a couple of times as to why producers like to have pundits with a certain view. This is such a refreshing, realistic view into why the media looks the way it is, as opposed to, oh, they're being bought off or stuff like this, where there's a real logistical feat in terms of putting up this content and getting enough eyeballs on it to justify it, and how to then optimize within that system. Just a side note I wanted to put out there. I think this is why the media looks the way it is because this is what people like to consume. It's same thing with clickbait. People use clickbait because it works, because people click on it.
It's the incentive structure, yeah.
Views are kind of all over the place. That tends to come off as a sign that you're not a very mature or organized thinker, and that's kind of unattractive. This mix of being confident, consistent, and knowledgeable might not seem like that big of a deal, but it is much harder than it looks. Having had to do this myself for many years is one of the reasons why I tend to have a lot of respect for successful pundits at the professional level, even if I don't necessarily agree with them at the personal level. Take Ann Coulter, for instance. I think she's pretty out there, but I also have some respect for the fact that she's been able to make a go of this profession for 20 years. For 2 decades, she has been writing a weekly column and going on television shows and churning out books. And she's able to talk about pretty much any issue that headlines or producers throw at her, and always from the perspective of like a mainline partisan Republican, even as the definition of a mainline partisan Republican has changed a lot over the years. So even if you think her commentary is a net negative contribution to the world, I still think it is possible to respect her as a professional. But Ann Coulter is also a good case study because the success of some of the more extreme political pundits of her sort also reflects some of the market pressures of this profession. As the media landscape is getting ever more crowded with this huge abundance of TV shows and newspapers and magazines and news websites and podcasts and YouTube channels, the pundit world is getting pulled in 2 different directions. On the one hand, there has never been more market demand for pundits to provide content for all of these media outlets, to write the columns and host the shows and serve on the panels and all the rest. This has made the job of professional political pundit a much more viable career option for a much larger assortment of people. But I would say it has also resulted in a lot of rather subpar people getting into the industry. I think there are a lot of signs that in modern America, a certain desperation for content is resulting in a lot of people getting hired as political commentators who really shouldn't. You can easily identify these people because they're sort of a caricature of the values I was describing before. Instead of confident, they are just vain and self-important. Instead of having broad, generalized knowledge, they just repeat the same cliches in every context. And instead of having a consistent worldview, they are just unthinking mouthpieces for their favored political party. I don't mean to be beating up on conservatives so much, by the way. I'm just honestly less familiar with left-wing pundits because I don't consume as much of that media. Anyway,
Yeah, I could think of a couple left-wing people we could slot into those.
Preponderance of B-grade pundits also means that it takes a lot more to get noticed and actually rise to be successful in like the upper tiers of the profession. Which brings us back to Ben Shapiro. I actually relate to Ben a lot because we are the same age, and presumably got bit by the political commentary bug around the same time. But Ben has obviously been a billion times more successful than me, which I respect, but also view as a bit of a cautionary tale on the price of pundit fame. Thanks to his enormous ambition and self-discipline, Ben was able to start working as a professional political commentator when he was just a teenager. This was a big deal.
Yeah, that is just, sorry, I just want to get back to...
Working as a professional political commentator when he was just a...
Man.
Emo hair Ben Shapiro.
Yeah, first off, damn, he's looking fresh. Man, I don't know if you should be, if it's a good I don't know if you're a good parent if you let your kid do this young. I kind of feel the same way about Greta Thunberg, you know, where it's like, okay.
Because you're setting your kid up to have like some kind of infamy or have a lot of enemies, people hating on them. Yeah.
It's like, can you really consent to that level of fame, knowing like you don't know what that's going to come with, like entering the public eye that much? I think there's a similar argument to be made for like child actors, where it's like, damn, I don't know if like it's, you know. If you are, you know, for example, incredibly poor and you're trying to get child actor, it's like, okay, that's probably worth the trade-off there. That's like, you know, that's fair. But, man, when you're this young, and I guess maybe, you know, for both Ben Shapiro and Greta Thunberg, you can make the case that, you know, well, maybe they're doing real good. You know, particularly Greta Thunberg would say, you know, I'm less, like, politically involved as much as I am an activist for this one specific issue, right? And to a certain level as well, I'm sure the kids themselves are driving it partially as well, you know. I doubt that they were just told one day, but at the same time, man, if the kid tells you they want to go drive the race car, like you should say no. And man, I really just wonder sometimes if it's appropriate and right to allow kids to enter the arena like this, because man, it can be vicious. I mean, I'm sure you've seen your fair share of just like mind-melting shit on Greta Thunberg, where it's like, I cannot believe people are saying this about a child. Like, this is wild.
Teenager. This was a big deal because society does not generally think of teenagers as having particularly worthwhile political opinions, just because people at that age do not tend to have a lot of depth of knowledge about the world. But Ben was able to make up for this by ratcheting up his other two stats: confidence and consistency. He was able to overcome his handicap and stand out in a crowded marketplace by carrying himself in this extremely assertive way and being very consistently right-wing. Ben Shapiro is now in his mid-30s, and I think he would be the first to tell you that he is a much wiser man than he used to be. In recent years in particular, I think you can quite clearly see that he has come under the influence of older, more intellectual men like Jordan Peterson and Sam.
No, JJ! Oh, gosh. Well, I guess to be fair, hold on. What was this video put out? 3 years ago? God, when even is that? Okay, 2019. Okay, yeah, to be fair, this was before I think Jordan B. Peterson, at least in my opinion, truly went off the deep end. Where he just, like, I legitimately sometimes wonder if, like, that coma caused him mental damage. Because the way he speaks now, the things he says are just legitimately mental to me.
Yeah, I mean, he's kind of a crazy person, but never, I mean, like, if I just narrowly construe what he's saying here, it's like older, more intellectual men. Well, okay, technically, yes.
Yeah, I think, and I guess to be fair, the criticisms of Ben Shapiro, I keep mixing these names up. The criticisms of Jordan B. Peterson have always been much more about, like, his policies and stuff. In terms of his, like, more philosophical and self-help thought, those actually are legitimately, you know, quite good. And definitely leagues above, you know, what I think are his pretty flawed political takes. And this is also multiple years ago. Sam Harris, I think, also a very good person, very good thinker. It's funny, I just got into a huge debate with a friend last night about the Sam Harris take about suppressing information on the Hunter Biden laptop story, but that's a separate diatribe for another time.
Sam Harris, and this has made him into a more thoughtful and sophisticated thinker. He may have started out as an Ann Coulter type, but now wants to be something more. This year, he wrote an ambitious new book called The Right Side of History: How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great. It was a more deep and thoughtful book than many of his previous ones, which tended to be rather shrill and simplistically partisan. But then when he went on the BBC to promote his new book, all the host wanted to talk about was the various extreme things he had said when he was younger. He had to answer for a time in his life when he was much more of a product of the professional pressures of being a political commentator than he is.
I think JJ is doing a really good job here, just sort of to note, on painting the story in a way where you can really see the evolution of Ben Shapiro. To be fair, it's a very charitable one, although it is one I think I do agree with. But I'm sure there's some people that would say, he's letting Ben Shapiro off the hook, so it's worth noting that. But I just thought it's really good to note here the storytelling, the cohesive narrative that JJ is creating here in regards to this. And I think it's an important narrative because, man, it really does feel like sometimes we don't provide people with room to grow. It's like we never expect people to change their minds, or at least I don't ever expect people to change their minds in a single conversation, right? You're never going to debate a Christian out of being a Christian, or an atheist into being a Christian in one conversation. That's just not how people work.
Yeah,
but sorry, go.
Oh no, I was going to say, and the demand for consistency that we put on people, especially on political pundits, is going to kind of conflict with their ability to grow and change over time. Because then it's just like, am I going to look like a hypocrite if I change my mind?
Yeah, and what we were talking about earlier, when people start to change their minds, they go from I'm certain to I don't know. But as a pundit, you can't say I don't know, right? It's actually similar to the phenomenon. I don't know how familiar you are with this, but the idea, and I don't know how widespread this is. I don't want to comment on necessarily how widespread it is because I'm really not sure. But the idea of, for example, a pastor having a crisis of faith and not being able to come out as an atheist because this is their livelihood, is being a pastor. They have a degree in theology and stuff like this. It's their whole life, it's their whole community, and just sort of quietly resigning in the background that I'm not nearly as faithful as I once was, but not being able to come out about that. It's a very sort of similar idea.
Now, when his success allows him greater independence to define his career on his own terms. Now, Ben Shapiro is an adult, and I'm sure he will do fine, but I do worry a bit about the degree that he has become a bad role model. You see a lot of people getting into professional political commentary at younger and younger ages these days. Not only people in their early 20s, but teenagers and even kids. And these kiddos are trying to make a name for themselves in a political commentary marketplace that is not only getting more and more competitive, but is also descending into a kind of shock jock culture where you have to be extremely wild and outrageous to even get noticed. I don't want to get too smug on my...
That is also another massive thing that goes on in Twitch politics where you have really young people sometimes. And I don't know, this is going to sound pretty condescending. I guess I'm pretty young too. So maybe I should, not throw so many rocks around in this stone house, not throw so many rocks around in this glass house I live in. But I remember the example that really comes out to me is the Dylan Burns situation with Prime K's, where it's just undeniable that Dylan fucked up massively. Super big. He fucked up hugely. And frankly, in my opinion, I don't think he did enough to make up for it. Although, the trouble is, he did do everything Prime asked of him. So it's almost like I think Prime should have asked more of him. But it's hard to ask the victim, Prime, in that scenario, to drag this out anymore, when I'm sure Prime just wants to move on and get on with his life. That being said, something that a lot of people were talking about in the Dylan Burns situation, something that I think the DGG sort of Destiny universe is still really divided on. You'll still see to this day, at least in the subreddit, which is I think the community space I'm most active in, people talking about how they don't feel right about what Dylan did. They feel like he didn't pay the proper price. There was a lot of discussion on the fact that Dylan was incredibly young. I think he was like 20 at the time when the accusations came out, and how, man, that kind of decision is very understandable for a 20-year-old to make. Very understandable for a 20-year-old to make that big of a fuck up. But man, you're not fucking up your own life, you're fucking up other people's lives. And it sort of emerged into this meta discussion of like, man, maybe we should not have 19, 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds even, becoming these like hyper, aggressive champions of ideologies or messengers for really important things when they are prone to have their minds change and make mistakes and learn and grow, at that stage in your life. And it's something that's really dangerous because, young people, they come out of the gates swinging. And you see this throughout, I think Destiny's a great example. He's talked about how he's grown a lot, even in his mid-20s. I think in general, there's a big sentiment among people my age that were online in politics, that a lot of us, it's sort of the meme, never ask, a Gen Zer what their political opinions were in 2015. There's a lot of evolution there of people falling down these rabbit holes and then only later realizing, oh my God, I was such a fool, for falling for this stuff. That it really, I think, does give me pause to see so many young people getting involved, especially in this kind of environment where there are those pressures, as opposed to like a more positive environment, like getting involved with like canvassing or something like that. But when you become like a pundit, all these incentives that JJ's been talking about, I think especially wreak havoc on a young mind.
I think I agree with almost everything you said, but I still feel a little bit conflicted about it because I think there is a role for like peer messaging to get young people interested in politics in the first place. I think it helps if they can see other people who are like close to their own age, you know, kind of helping them form their political opinions, helping them talk through whatever issues they're interested in, and just pulling them into the space to begin with. And so I don't think I would want there to be no young people doing political commentary.
Yeah, especially because young people have their flaws, but it's not like old people or middle-aged people. It's like, oh, once you get to 30, then you don't have any flaws in terms of your political thought. So you almost want that counterbalance of like, we want the mistakes of youth counterbalancing the mistakes of middle and older age, as opposed to, you know, it all going to one side, leading us in one direction. Like, for example, that's a problem with a lot of local politics. You know, young people undoubtedly are going to vote for some dumb things. But when it's only old people voting for dumb things, I mean, that's how you get zoning, being what the shit show that is. That's how you get zero movement on police reform in a lot of local areas. So, yeah, it's tough. I think when JJ talks about Ben Shapiro being a bad role model, the key is I think we need good role models. But unfortunately, there seems to be this rejection, especially on the right, of like, oh, young people, you don't know what you're talking about. Although recently, I don't know if you've seen any of this, I've seen a lot of discussion of right-wingers talking about, man, we need a better youth appeal, which is a huge departure from the typical, you know, shut up Greta Thunberg, shut up you dumb college kids. They're really starting to feel... It's funny how a sobering election can really open up a political movement's eyes to their own flaws and their own shortcomings. And it's really interesting watching that happen to another political movement, as opposed to, you know, me being in the trenches and like the Destiny subreddit saying like, oh my god, you know, this Bernie or bust shit is so stupid. It's really interesting to see that play out in a different, and see the differences and the parallels.
Yeah, I mean, I hope they'll be able to do something like that. You know, like like the Republican Party try to do more like youth outreach and try to meet them halfway. But I suspect that that's not really going to get very far. And the reason I suspect it is because like I've seen things like that happen before. Like, for example, after Mitt Romney lost in 2012, there was a really big discussion in the Republican Party about how, like, you guys, like, we really need to try to, like, appeal to minorities more and try to, you know, try to get them on our side. And you know, hearing that at the time, I thought, well, this is great. I mean, it's plausible they might actually like take that seriously and want to move in that direction. And then 4 years later, we have Trump. You know? So, yeah.
And especially, I mean, that comes off the 2000. That's only 8 years from the 2004 election, where I think it was George H.W. Bush got something like, or not H.W. Sorry, with George W. Bush got, I think, almost a majority of the Hispanic vote. I think he didn't get an outright majority, but he was like pushing. He was like 46% of the Hispanic vote. Yeah. One thing that I think really blocks the ability for political movements to do that, to sort of make those strategic transitions, is the fact that, you know, you never get to just set things in a vacuum. You have to set ideas, and they're going to play out in the real world, right? You can't just say, okay, Republicans, we're going to believe this now. Well, the beliefs of Republicans are going to be shaped by, you know, the spaces that they occupy, the values they have, the events. And something I was talking with Half Baked Takes about just yesterday, just a couple of days ago, in regards to the political messaging, is that I really wonder how much of political messaging is being poisoned by what is good social media messaging. The idea that a Republican campaign, instead of running a more moderate message that helps them more in the election, runs a more partisan, hyper-conservative message. Not because they think it's going to help them more, but because they're so poisoned by the fact that those messages do well in social media. Right, that, you know, and when we were talking about this, because I felt a lot more confident to say I feel like that does happen on the left wing all the time. You see left wing people make arguments that are not good for getting support, things like defund the police, but they are really popular online, and it starts to poison it. Where it's like, man, don't say that. Might get you likes on Twitter, but Jesus Christ, do not say that in West Virginia, where Joe Manchin's trying to hold on to his Democratic seat. You know, it's a miracle we even have that in the first place. And yeah, I really wonder if that is poisoning the ability for political movements to go for good messaging. And if that's the case, I wonder what the future holds. If people are going to keep doubling down on these messages and go further and further.
My own high horse about this, because I have certainly done plenty of awful political commentary over the years. But I like to think at a certain point I did have a sort of crossroads moment, a moment in which I had to think seriously about what it would take to become a super successful political pundit, and whether or not I was willing to make that sacrifice. Not just a sacrifice in terms of my dignity and my long-term personal reputation or anything like that, but a sacrifice in terms of what I theoretically got involved in political commentary to do in the first place, which was analyze the news in a useful and helpful way. As is so often the case in life, there are always trade-offs that have to be made in the delicate balance between commercial success, fame, self-respect, and personal ethics. And if you don't strike that right balance,
wow, it's sad that we have to balance those things against each other at all.
Yeah.
Back to haunt you. But you know, I don't want to paint too grim a picture of the state of political commentary. While there are a lot of hackish people out there, we are also living in a truly great era of some really remarkable public intellectuals and political minds. These pundits are a little less famous and a little less entertaining, but also capable of expressing powerful and insightful opinions on political events in a way that is mature, measured, and very well informed. There might be less of this sort of commentary overall, but still enough for it to be pretty overwhelming. I know whenever I go to the bookstore and look at the politics section, or the history section, or the social and cultural affairs section, I get pretty intimidated. It would take forever to get up to speed on what all of the smart pundits are saying, which is where today's video sponsor, Blinkist, comes in. I'm very excited about this sponsor because I think that they are providing a legitimately useful service that I have already personally benefited from. Basically, what Blinkist does is take popular nonfiction books and condense them down into short summaries that you can read or listen to in about 15 minutes. They have an online version, but also this handy phone app version as well. Blinkist summaries are very well written. They are not just superficial overviews, but a genuine effort to summarize a book's key points and the author's main argument, which allows you to quickly get the gist of a book without having to invest the hours of reading it from start to finish. I've been checking out a lot of conservative pundit books on Blinkist lately in an effort to find out who actually has substantial things to say and who is just a partisan hack. So on the one hand, you could listen to a summary of, say, Judge Jeanine Pirro's Liars, Leakers, and Liberals, the case against the anti-Trump conspiracy, or maybe The Big Lie, exposing the Nazi roots of the American left by Dinesh D'Souza. And then on the other end, you could listen to, say, a summary of Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind, From Burke to Eliot, or David Brooks's...
I love just the contrast between those oh, Jesus Christ. The front page of a book, the covers. Yeah, this one, The Big Lie, it's in like the Nazi font, and there's all this stuff, and then it's going forward here, it's like, oh wow, there's like a little stick figure, and he's got these shadows. I think that's so funny.
Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind, From Burke to Eliot, or David Brooks's The Road to Character. And then you can listen to a summary of Ben Shapiro's Right Side of History
Can we
and
pause
decide
for a
for
second?
yourself, which...
So I think that's kind of an interesting point about the book covers, that maybe people who want to be taken more seriously might purposely try to contrast themselves with the more sensationalist stuff, and they might be doing themselves a disservice by doing that, by being like less attention grabby.
Yeah, it's sort of there's also I think a worry of sort of selecting for your audience. You know, when you're a bigger fan, I don't, at a certain level, I think you become a lot more immune to audience capture, but it's still a concern. I mean, when you look at someone like Elon Musk, this is my personal theory to explain, how some of these baffling decisions where, man, if you take any human being and you give them an army of followers like Elon Musk has that are going to defend him no matter what, I gotta wonder what that does for your ability to self-criticize. It's kind of like, I don't know if you've watched any Bill Burr comedy stand-ups, but Bill Burr will sort of talk about how, as a man, you just want to have sex with every woman you see, but you can't. but then you become a rich man, and you look like Tiger Woods, and there's no training for what to do when you actually can pursue the vast majority of women that you do see. So it's no wonder that they fail. I sort of feel the same way as a human being. You know, you get a lot of negative criticism, a lot of negative feedback. I wonder how resilient the human psyche really is if all of a sudden it just gets showered in a wave of, you know, people that are in a way almost enabling. It's almost analogous to, like, you know, someone with a mental illness having an enabler that says, no, you are fine, you know, you don't need to self-reflect. I wonder what that does to, like, someone's political thoughts when they get awash in that kind of wave.
Category it belongs in. Anyway, if you click on the link in the thing below, you can try an unlimited 7-day free trial of Blinkist and cancel at any time. And if you decide you do like it, you can get 25% off your yearly subscription. Anyway, what is your sense of the state of American political commentary these days? Are there any pundits you think are hitting the right balance between being professionally successful and actually offering useful and thoughtful political analysis? Or is the whole scene just a big mess of loudmouth nuts? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you all next week.
I would think the optimal solution is to have the aesthetic of a loudmouth nut while offering, like, takes that are relatively sane. So
yeah, I obviously I'm sort of showing my colors here, but I think that Destiny actually gets pretty close to doing a good job of this, where, you know, Destiny does still have these firebrand moments, but I think in most of his conversations he'll still get across, like, a very sort of, like, wholesome isn't the right word, but I guess, like, not corrosive worldview. Like, he can have moments where he blows up on people and you get that blood pumping, but it doesn't necessarily then need to devolve into, you know, all Republicans are racist or things like this. He can have, like, a much more positive message on, like, you know, having uncertainty about things and, you know, being skeptical and open to changing your mind, things like this. It reminds me of I think there was a panel I was on once where we had this discussion about sort of Ben Shapiro and the idea of, you know, Ben Shapiro sort of, I think sometimes, especially in sort of his earlier iterations, wielded the aesthetic of being correct and logical in favor of things that I think weren't correct and logical. And I think there's a real potential to sort of do that the correct way, to wield that aesthetic for things that are, you know, good, you know, to wield the idea of being, you know, the logic lord, but in ways that actually do help people enhance their critical thinking skills, not just berating people into believing what you believe, but to actually, you know, give an appreciation for the ability to be wrong and, you know, all the stuff we've talked about already.
yeah, I have, like, an overall kind of mixed opinion about Destiny. I think he does, you know, really good at some things and really bad at other things, but, like, but this I think is a big argument in favor of the positive for him, is that I think he does a really good job of striking the balance between being entertaining and being, like, having sane takes. Yeah.
All right, so next we've got what is good and bad about conservatism. And then that will lead into evangelicals becoming Republicans. So these two, I think, are going to be much more sort of applying the principles that he talks about in that first video, sort of to the development of conservatism as a political movement in sort of North America and Canada, which he sees as pretty culturally ubiquitous, and I tend to agree.
So when someone goes around calling them a conservative, what does that even mean? I've been thinking about this a lot lately because it seems that conservative is becoming a pretty big category to describe a pretty large group of people. Politicians like President Trump and Mitch McConnell and Ted Cruz, they all say they're conservatives. So do media people like Sean Hannity and Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson. And so do all of these wild internet characters like Diamond and Silk and Laura Loomer and Paul Joseph Watson. And then you have these even more extreme people like Mike Cernovich and Milo Yiannopoulos and Alex Jones. They all claim to be conservative too. Now, I actually self-identify as a conservative as well, but when I look at some of these characters, I really feel pretty turned off. In fact, I would say that I find a lot of these people, like, quite actively repulsive. I don't personally feel I have a lot in common with these people, even though in theory I guess we're on the same side, we're in the same category. So let us try to figure out how we have gotten here. How conservative became this really big, giant category that encompasses so many different types of people. So there are basically two theories that explain why people have political opinions. One is that we choose our political opinions in a completely rational context. Like, I guess at some point we just sit down with a big book of all the different political philosophies and then we pick the one that we like best. Like, I mean, obviously no one literally says that this is how it works, but I do think that when you hear people like Ben Shapiro talk, they would say that, you know, they're conservative because conservatism is like the most logical, fact-based philosophy out there. Or in other words, like, his political worldview is primarily an intellectual thing. But then the other theory holds that political opinions are just sort of something you develop naturally based on the kind of person that you are. In other words, your politics will probably just be an extension of something else about you, you know, like how old you are, or how religious you are, or how much money you have, or how you feel about authority figures and things like that. So for someone like me, you could say that I'm a conservative because I grew up in a very comfortable white middle-class family, and I've always been pretty trusting of authority figures. Ever since I was a little kid, I always cared a lot about doing the right thing and pleasing my parents and teachers and never getting into any sort of trouble. I mean, I have always been pretty eccentric and I like to ask a lot of questions, but I don't think in any real sense I've ever been much of a rebel. By the time I was in high school, which is I think when most people sort of start to politically self-identify, I was very obviously conservative because I had started to develop this philosophy that held that basically the way things currently were was the way things should, you know, always be. People who were overly critical of the way things were obviously bad and wrong. One of the values my parents really drilled into me when I was a child was to never be ungrateful or spoiled. And as a result, I always sort of associated rebellious or unsatisfied people with being ungrateful, like that these were people who were not sufficiently appreciative of how good we all had it. For this reason, the sort of conservative politics that I was always the most attracted to was the one that had a message like, hey, isn't it awesome that you get to live in this wonderful, rich, free society? You should be grateful for this and fight for the preservation of the social order that gives you and all of your friends and relations all of these great things. And you should do what you can to ensure that everyone else has access to all of these great things as well. Specifically, this means stick up for our capitalist economic system because it provides our wealth and prosperity, support stable traditional families because they provide our lives with structure and meaning, be grateful for authority figures like the police and military because they keep us safe, respect our democratic political system because it gives us the freedom to think and believe whatever we want, and be respectful of Christianity too because it gives our society its moral foundation. This is basically what I would call the traditional conservative worldview. The worldview of someone who sees the value in basically keeping things as they are. The worldview of someone who doesn't have much interest in challenging the status quo. A lot of people are not really...
I just wanted to say I find this so refreshingly honest. I feel like there's a lot of political pundits out there. This is what the Destiny talks about has talked about, where, you know, if you ask, you know, someone, why do people dislike you? The answer is going to be very revealing. So some people think, oh, people dislike me because I'm a truth teller and they serve lies and they're evil and I'm good. Whereas like a more honest answer would be like, you know, I have some pretty divisive opinions. I could be very aggressive in the way I go about things. You know, this kind of thing just lends itself to, you know, soured milk in terms of like, you know, relationships and stuff. So it's very understandable. I just really appreciate, I think, JJ sort of laying his cards on the table and being like, this is what I believe, and I do genuinely believe it, I'll defend it, but it's no surprise that I believe this, and, you know, not, you know, Maoism, you know. there seems to be some sort of correlation between, you know, how I was raised and what I believe.
I sort of feel like, though, he hasn't really gotten into saying why he thinks people oppose conservatism. He did briefly mention, like, oh, when I was younger, I thought that those people were just unappreciative, right?
Yeah, I think to be fair, he's mostly getting he's using his own personal life in which he is a conservative as an example of as to why he believed the things he believed, because he grew up in a nice middle class family that was relatively well off. But I think he's going to sort of get into that specifically with what conservatism looks like now. I mean, I think he's actually just getting into that, and I think this next point is actually really fascinating.
The worldview of someone who doesn't have much interest in challenging the status quo. A lot of people are not really conservative in this way anymore, however.
Yep.
A lot of the most famous and influential conservatives today are a lot younger and a lot more radical. They don't seem as motivated by gratitude and respect as much as a spirit of rebellion and a desire to stir up a lot of trouble. And why is this? It seems like a bit of a contradiction. Well, I think a lot of it has to do with what I was talking about before, which is this idea that a lot of politics is as rooted in personality as it is in ideas. These days, a lot of famous conservatives particularly young, famous conservatives, make a big deal of the fact that they used to be left-wingers.
Because you used to be a liberal.
Right.
And then you became a conservative.
That's correct.
Conservatives like to hear stories like this because, you know, a lot of folks treat politics like religion these days, and everyone likes to hear stories of conversion. But I think that having so many former left-wingers in the modern conservative movement has had a more dramatic consequence than some people realize. I mean, if you believe that people get their political views just from ideas, then it's really not that big a deal. Conservative ideas, I guess, are just better and more persuasive. But if you believe that a lot of people primarily get into politics because of their personality, then one consequence of this is that you're going to have a lot of people with the fundamental left-wing personality who are now embracing right-wing politics. And that seems to create a very novel and strange flavor of person. In contrast to your stereotypical person who likes things the way they are and is thus drawn to conservative politics, how would we generalize the stereotypical sort of person who is drawn to left-wing politics? To start, it would certainly be somebody who thinks that the way things are isn't that great and society needs a lot of fixing. They would also be generally distrustful of authority figures because, of course, authority figures would be complicit in enforcing the unjust society. They would be open to radical, dramatic solutions to fixing perceived problems, and they'd have no problem being seen as a rebel or somebody that's very controversial and disruptive. So you can probably see where I'm going with this. A lot of today's right-wing converts still have a lot of these stereotypically left-wing personality traits. They still view their society as like fundamentally bad and broken. They still think people with power don't deserve to be trusted. And they still want to have this glamorous image as like provocative rebels. The big difference is they've just swapped out left-wing answers for right-wing answers.
I think this is a really interesting point, and it's one that I think I actually agree with a lot. I think sort of at the beginning there when he talks about the fundamental left-wing personality, I think that's going a bit too far. I think these are more archetypes that are representative of our current time. But it's something that I really agree with. And I just want to see here, this video came out in, 2018. So this is before the vaccine, and we see the massive, sort of uprising on the right against the institutions of academia and stuff like that. This is before the election, and you see a lot of sort of more right-wing circles start turning against law enforcement, especially federal law enforcement. I think it's borne out to become very true. The only sort of difference I would have, in my opinion, versus JJ's is I think this is more representative of a cultural shift than specific right-wing figures. I don't think it's the case that Candace Owens caused this. I think it's the case that Candace Owens is a symptom. Because there's also a whole bunch of right-wing voters that are agreeing with these kind of, it's not the case that I think Candace Owens comes in and convinces all these Republicans that, now's the time. I think if it wasn't Candace Owens, it would have been someone else, because I think the crisis of faith in our institutions from the mid-2000s, the 9/11 plus the financial crisis and everything that those entailed with the bailouts and the wars, just makes it so that the default starting position of many, many people in the West, particularly America, is a sense of distrust of a generic idea of elites and people that aren't like me. And you see that then that sort of that flavor find its way into many different political movements who slot in their own answers. Oh, the elites? Well, that's the Jews. Or, oh, the elites? Well, that is liberal academia. Oh, the elites? That's the conservative billionaires, the Koch brothers. This stuff is everywhere, I feel like. It's almost the default position in a lot of, for a lot of people, and across a lot of different political persuasions. And I think that's really the big thing that's driving a bunch of this stuff, is that like everyone is still living in like the phantom shadow of the Twin Towers. Long after the buildings have been cleared and Ground Zero has been redone, people still cannot escape that mindset.
It seems to me like a lot of what's going on is that when people are just in certain like higher stress emotional states, that they're just they develop this kind of like disposition toward combative political stances, and then it just becomes kind of secondary which combative political stance they want to take, and they're, it could be far left, it could be far right, it could be some idiosyncratic thing outside the mainstream, but what they really know is they don't want the status quo, right? Because they're unhappy with things as they stand, and it just seems like the particular stances they take probably shouldn't be taken at face value, because those are all just like in service to their discontent.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I wonder about is social media. And if it's the case that if social media never developed, would our political landscape look radically different? Because a part of me wonders with the sort of if this particular political like phase was re-entrenched and reinforced by social media. Is it the case that we would still have people talking about how, the Bush administration lied about 9/11 as a reason for why they can't trust a vaccine? Would that really be the case to the same degree if it wasn't for social media really radicalizing people, getting people set in their echo chambers, feeding into a lot of the worst parts of our political discourse? That's one thing that I really wonder about. And if there had been different events in the early 2000s that led to a different political persuasion, let's say, for example, there was, a massive failure of individuals, right? And the government came in and saved it. Would we then see the opposite? A real re-entrenchment of an over reliance on government. The idea that it is always the answer and stuff like that. Those are the questions I really wonder, because that's really important for sorting out the problem. Do we really need to focus on just avoiding the failures of our institutions because they run away? Or is it the case that social media is just going to reinforce whatever the flavor of the month is? And it just happened that Facebook, goes up in 2007 or whatever it is, along with YouTube, and reinforces what's big in 2007? Well, let me tell you what, not liking the Bush administration, not liking the military-industrial complex. And we just see the echoes of that. That's the question that I really wonder about.
We have a chatter who mentioned the difference between the, American conservatism versus Canadian conservatism. J.J. McCullough is Canadian, and I think a lot of the kind of things that you're mentioning, to some degree they're worldwide, but they're more specifically American, right?
Yeah. Especially because also the internet, especially for a long time, it's really starting to change now, was American, right? Like all the websites were American, all the discourse. It's the funny thing where, if it's a prime case panel and there's like 8 Europeans, they're going to be talking about, Joe Biden versus Donald Trump.
So yeah. Anyway, so J.J. McCullough earlier on was talking about how his the way that he approaches conservatism, and was thinking of it as like maintaining the pillars of social order that allow us to have the good things we have or something. And we were saying like that This is like a pretty sane political take, and I believe that's probably what the chatter was responding to when he said like this seems more like Canadian conservatism than American conservatism, because I think the caricature of American conservatives is that they're a little more like far out there and conspiratorial and stuff. But on the other hand, you might, when he was talking about, when J.J. McCullough was talking about like kind of wild out there political pundits, like a lot of these people are Canadian, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I can't. I was messaging Not So Erudite literally just before the show started. I was like, man, Canada, you guys aren't sending their best. Yeah, Jordan B. Peterson. Isn't Stephen Crowder Canadian as well? Lawrence Southern.
Yeah.
Yeah. Canada's not sending their best, guys. We're focused on the wrong border here. I think when it comes to Canadian conservatism, it has been more it is a little bit slower on the path that American conservatism is on, but I think it's still on the same path. I think fundamentally, you look at Canadian conservatism, you can see the same conflict that American conservatism is going through. It's just the case that Canada is generally more left-wing, so it's less pronounced. But like, for example, the newest premier of the Conservative Party of Canada, Pierre Poilievre, is very much a more populist sort of firebrand type guy. He was a guy who very aligned himself heavily with the trucker movement, right? And look at the trucker movement. I mean, if that's not this newer brand of populist right-wing conservatism, I don't know what is, right? The reality is that I think it's just the case that Canadian conservatism is more akin to what JJ's talking about, because they have not yet gone through all the transformations that American conservatism has to the same degree. Whereas American conservatism, we've already been through 2016, and now 2020. We are firmly down in that trench, whereas Canada is still sort of making their way to join us.
Yeah, I can't really recommend that they continue down that path.
Yeah, get it if you can, guys, but I don't know if you. But I'm skeptical if you can.
Copy the good parts of what America's doing, not I don't know.
Noted controversial guy Gavin McInnes actually has a pretty good video about this on YouTube. He starts out being this super punk rock guy, and then at the end he morphs into a conservative. His thesis is that there's no real difference between being a rebel and being a conservative these days. Now again, how can this be possible? How is it that the rebel personality can so easily segue into right-wing politics? Well, this gets into one of the fundamental challenges of conservatism as a workable philosophy. It is actually very difficult to make a political philosophy that is just based around respecting the current way of doing things. For example, if I am a conservative in Canada, does that mean I should support the Canadian healthcare system just because it currently exists? A lot of people would say it is a socialist system, but because it is the system that currently exists, does that mean it is the correct conservative position to support it? By that logic, Republicans should support Obamacare too, because it currently exists. If you take this to its logical extreme, no conservative should ever support repealing any law ever, since the second any law is passed, it becomes part of the status quo. Or what about, say, if I lived in Cuba? Would supporting that country's communist dictatorship be the conservative thing to do, just because that's been their way of doing things for a long time now? Or
It's really interesting because in certain countries that actually is kind of true. It's been talked about how in Russia, the older generations almost do feel a little bit of like the traditional conservative, like, you know, back in my day. But for the Soviet Union, which obviously is in huge contrast to what we like think of as like the actual conservative position.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to look at like the Chinese political spectrum too, because it probably just doesn't map on very closely to what we've got going on in America here. But what I would expect is that probably the more like culturally conservative people in China are likely to be the people that support the like status quo people in power as well. That's my guess.
Or what about the fundamentalist regime in Iran? It's a pretty conservative government by the standards of that country. So you could say that the conservative position is to support socialism in Canada, communism in Cuba, and fundamentalism in Iran, because all of those ideas represent the status quo. It is problems like this that led to the creation of a more universalist conservative philosophy in the mid to late 20th century, which was really more of what we in the Anglo-American world would call classical liberalism, or what they still call in a lot of other places just plain liberalism. Classical liberalism of this sort is basically just the ideology of freedom, particularly individual freedom as like the highest social good, mixed in with a love of free market capitalism as like the best economic system. So this more modern and narrow definition of conservatism basically says that the Anglo-American tradition of classical liberalism is the main thing we should be concerned about conserving. So a conservative of this sort would say that the Canadian healthcare system, or the Cuban dictatorship, or the Iranian theocracy are not in fact worth conserving because these things go against the values of classical liberalism. In those cases, the correct conservative position would actually be to favor radical change. And this, in short, is the reason why a lot of young people have found a way to be rebels and conservatives at the same time. These sorts of people would say, like, you know, our society has become so corrupted with left-wing, anti-classical liberal ideas that we must really rebel and fight to preserve them. The authority figures that we would normally trust to preserve our classical liberal foundations are now warring against them, which means the whole world has kind of gone topsy-turvy. And in fairness, I do think there is...
And man, talk about it, just how well that maps onto a lot of the arguments that are happening years later now from this video being put out in regards to like the FBI. And now lots of conservative Republicans thinking, you know, it's a totally corrupt institution. It's just wildly accurate. I think what JJ's talking about here is true. There's a caveat. And that caveat is that you might be able to square the ideological, problem of being a conservative and a rebel. But if we go back to the personality archetype, that's the thing that you can't square. And I think you do see a lot of failures where, you know, if I look at right-wing people, particularly pundits, they don't, symbolize the like traditional conservative person. You know, these aren't people that, are going to be giving you Southern hospitality or being very respectful and stand up for the thing that's right, and are going to be, I think a lot of the positive aspects of like the conservative personality of like of sort of that small town America feel. People like Charlie Kirk do not emblemize that at all. Steven Crowder does not do any of that stuff. And I think that's where you sort of start to see this conflict. It almost reminds me of, I'm sure we're going to get into this in the third video where he talks about evangelicalism, but, Christians who act incredibly un-Christ-like, where, you hear Christ talk about, oh, turn the other cheek, love thy neighbor, love the sinner, hate the sin. It's like, wow, those are some great ideas. Let me go talk to some real Christians. And, it's like the Westboro Baptist Church, screaming at the, funeral of a dead veteran. Not to say that, all Christians are anywhere near as bad as Westboro Baptist Church.
I think that's very unrepresentative of what an average Christian is like. But
that's a much more extreme example. But I would still say, and I think it's actually quite compatible, that I would say the average Christian still fails to live up to those. And I would imagine that a lot of Christians would be very open about the fact that, we're human, we do sin, we are not above that either. It actually reminds me, I believe it was a Michael Knowles from the Daily Wire reviewed a Destiny video where Destiny was talking about how a lot of Christians are not Christ-like, and Michael Knowles was like, actually, that is kind of true. The reason we call them ideals, or the reason why we call them ideals, is because they are almost impossible to perfectly achieve. So in one sense, it is very understandable, but in the other sense, there's probably a level that goes too far. And I think there are some more mainstream Christian movements where it's clearly like you look at like mega churches, for example. This isn't like at least in my opinion, or I should say my opinion. From my understanding, these aren't a minor thing. These are quite significant depending upon where you are in the country with mega churches. And, these are just, like, these do not seem like, representations of, like, the humility or piety. When you see, like, Joel Osteen going around, like, in his, like, billion-dollar, private jet and things like this. Or not billion-dollar private jet, but his billion-dollar wealth and his private jets. There's a real problem in terms of living those values. And I think sort of the problem that you can't square in terms of the conservative becoming the rebel is that more personality side, where I do think you see a degradation of like the small c conservative values and conservative personality in their politics. The people we see leading are not, people that are understanding or respectful or have dignity, these kinds of things that I would say are sort of like, salt of the earth conservative values. It's, a New York billionaire named Donald Trump who's big into real estate and talks about grabbing women by the pussy. And I think there's a real, I think it's kind of sad that you see the death of that sort of more, of the sort of conservative personality and standing up for things like that.
So this is giving me a bunch of thoughts about like the relationship between Christianity and negative partisanship, because I think that's really interesting. Because if you think about like the way that a conservative Christian thinks about their world, a lot of their like positive uplifting values are going to be like Christian stuff, but then if you try to like put that on TV, it's seen as like divisive and controversial, and so this means that conservatives are in a way kind of almost obligated to presenting the more negative side of their worldview, because the positive side of their worldview is seen as so divisive, right? And it like probably contributes to the combative atmosphere of the
This
media.
comes pretty close to, I think, my thesis statement on evangelicalism in America, which we'll get into in this next video, which is that evangelicals saw the Republican Party as a way for them to push their ideas, but it was far more of a two-way street than evangelicals realized. And I think the principled evangelicals and Christians, which there are many of, no doubt, are kind of looking on in horror as they realize that far more than the Republican Party becoming Christian, Christianity has become Republican. Where you see, like it's Kenneth Copeland, preaching about how the election was stolen in his church. Just mind-boggling stuff, like the corruption of what ought be, pretty pure message about you and your relationship with Jesus Christ, and the salvation of your soul from eternal damnation is now like, and let's own the libs. I think that comes pretty close to my thesis statement, which is it was far more of a two-way street. And in a certain degree, man, it's like, Christians, I mean, like, you dug the grave, man. Like, when you are consistently, putting Christianity into the political arena where no one comes out clean, you can't act shocked when all of a sudden there's all these associations. I mean, is it any wonder that young people are becoming less and less religious when you guys came in on the side of satanic video games or satanic Dungeons and Dragons or climate change or gay marriage or all these things? Man, if you guys had stuck in your lane, then there's a much better case, I think, to be made, but you didn't, and this is the result.
There's a lot of truth to this. In a democratic democratic society, a lot of different ideologies will be able to come to power, which means that the conservative position will sometimes be the oppositional, rebellious one. But let us not let personality completely off the hook either. The obvious question is to ask why exactly some people get so upset with the supposed left-wing undermining of classical liberal values. Is it just because they believe that personal liberty and free markets are the way to go, and that undermining those values with, say, more regulations on free speech or more government involvement in the economy is going to, screw up this nice civilization that we have? In many cases, the answer is yes, absolutely. You might not agree with that conclusion, but it's a political opinion. But I think it is also true that you do have a sizable number of self-proclaimed conservatives who defend the values of classical liberalism simply because it offers a convenient pretext for them to indulge in a rather ugly side of their personality, which is to say a desire to indulge in bigotries or biases against people different from themselves. This sort of thing has always been the dark side of modern conservative politics. Some of the values of
Another thing, I really appreciate the honesty of being willing to call out sort of the downsides of your own political movement. This is something that I think is sorely lacking in America, is the fact that there's not enough call out on political aisles. Left-wing people call out crazies on the right all the time, but no one's going to care on the right. And similarly, people on the right are going to call out the crazies on the left, but there's not enough, really going on the offensive, I think, against the crazies on your side. I think it's part of the reason why Destiny has such a big appeal is because Destiny has a lot of, quote-unquote street cred for not giving water to the crazies on the left. And I think that's a big part of why he can come and have appeal to conservative audiences. There are other things too. The fact that, he grew up in a very Christian environment. He was a conservative himself. He's got a lot of that social currency as well. But I think the ideological currency is another big one that shouldn't be underestimated. The fact that Destiny, went to war with Hassan and Vosh. I think that makes a lot of right-wingers be like, okay, hold on. Let me hear him out here.
Yeah, it's a hard problem because if we do go to war with the craziest people on the left, then it turns into this narrative of the left is eating their own, right?
Yep. And it weakens you, right? It's like it's the principled thing to do. It's the prisoner's dilemma, right? It's almost like undermining norms in like the Senate, right? When Mitch McConnell blocks approving Merrick Garland, Democrats are like, that's bad, but man, if we don't start engaging some of these tactics, we're just going to lose. So that now it feels like we almost have to go to that level. Same thing, if the left is constantly self-criticizing and the right doesn't, and the right unites strength better, they're going to have better results. So there's a real incentive to go against that. I think, fingers crossed, this is true. You're starting to see the other incentive come into play, which is the fact that the people are starting to have enough of the crazies. Where particularly in the midterms,
I hope so.
the data's still out in the midterms, but it's really looking like persuasion, not turnout, was what won Democrats all these massive gains in the midterms. Where it wasn't the case that they were just getting out people that agreed with them, but there were independents and more right-leaning people that were voting for Democrats on the ballot. And if that's the case, then there's the incentive for political parties to return to normalcy and start calling out their worst elements, because now there's a reward for that.
I really want that to be true.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit cautious of that narrative because it sounds like too appealing to me. So I'm like wary of my own tendency to want to believe an appealing narrative. But I hope you're right.
Yep. So say we all.
Classical liberalism that modern conservatives seek to preserve, chief among them freedom of speech and the right to discriminate, are in fact often used for rather nasty purposes by rather nasty people. And when you combine these political goals with this kind of very disrespectful, rebellious personality, you get a really ugly style of politics. And I would say that this is obviously one of the big problems of conservative politics right now. Anyway, I know I'm throwing out a lot of big ideas here. Political philosophy is obviously a very big topic, and it's actually quite a difficult topic to summarize because there's so many different dimensions to it. But I want to hear what you have to say. Why do you think people become conservatives? If you're a conservative yourself, why do you think you wound up that way? Particularly, I want you to talk about your political views as they relate to your personality, not just ideas. Anyway, I look forward to reading those comments, and I will see you all next week. Hey guys, just one other thing I wanted to say before we go. I now have a Twitch channel. I did my first ever Twitch live stream last week. It really went well. It was a lot of fun. Played some Mario and answered a bunch of your questions about politics in Canada and a whole bunch of other things. And I'm going to do another live stream this coming Wednesday, December 26th, Canadian Boxing Day. Going to start at 5 p.m. Pacific time. So if you're into Twitch, follow me using my username here, and I hope to see you there.
Does he still do Twitch? Do you know?
I don't think so, no. Although here we can find out. I'm not a robot, I promise. I'm just on a VPN. Here we go.
They're seeing
Okay.
that VTuber and they're on guard against robots.
Oh, yeah. What do we have here? It's not live right now. Last video. Oh, not looking too good. I think he hasn't had a video within the 30 months that they get cleared out. So, yeah, not looking too good. Anyways, yeah, I basically think he comes pretty close to hitting the nail on the head there. There's a real big problem, I think, with the sort of personalities that are driving our politics, and I think they're mostly a result of the failures of our institutions in the mid-2000s and then social media's very corrupting effect on our discourse.
So one of the main
I did it again.
characteristics of the Republican Party of the United States is the leadership role played by evangelical Christians. For example, Vice President Mike Pence, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, and prominent senators like Ted Cruz, Tim Scott, and Josh Hawley all would fall under the broad category of evangelical Christians. The same is true for a number of prominent Republican-aligned political commentators, including Ann Coulter, Charlie Kirk, Candace Owens, Phil Robertson, and even Diamond and Silk. Now, why are evangelical Christians so drawn to the Republican Party? Well, the obvious answer is they really like its political agenda. For example, a recent 2020 Pew Research poll had 76% of evangelicals saying they agree with President Trump on all or many issues, with 81% saying Trump fights for what I believe in. 81% was also the rate of support that Trump got from evangelical Christians in the last election, though this rate has been pretty steady for Republican presidential candidates for a while now. So today we are going to look at how all of this happened, why it has become so easy to just take it for granted that evangelical Christians will support the Republican Party, and how this rigid support has affected the shape of the American two-party system. Now, it is important to remember that most Americans are not evangelical Christians. In fact, even most American Christians are not evangelical Christians. And things get even narrower when we separate white evangelical Christians from black evangelical Christians, who are often considered to be part of a sort of different culture. In 2017, the Public Religion Research Institute estimated white evangelical Christians to be about 17% of the US population, while the polling group Barna, which uses a stricter definition, says the number might be closer to just 6%. Now, before we go any further, we should obviously talk a little bit about what exactly an evangelical Christian even is, because as we can see, there is clearly a fair bit of subjectivity here. Evangelical is a Christian identity, although it is not exactly a denomination like Baptist or Lutheran or Pentecostal, though it may overlap with identities like those. No, it is really more of a broad theological term that describes how some people understand and practice Christianity at a more conceptual level. But I'm a theologian, so let us now turn things over to my good friend Andrew M. Henry, a PhD student in religious studies from Boston University, and the host of a very good religious education channel called Religion for Breakfast. So take it away, Andrew.
Thanks, JJ. So what is evangelicalism? Evangelicals form a subset of Protestant Christianity that emphasize a born-again experience, a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, evangelism, and biblicism. Let's go through these one by one. A born-again experience refers to an emotional conversion experience in which a person accepts Jesus Christ as their savior. The born-again experience is such a big deal to evangelicals that the historian Thomas Kidd calls evangelicalism the religion of the born again. This stems from the earliest decades of evangelicalism's history during the revivalist movements of the 18th century called the Great Awakening. Protestant ministers like John Wesley and George Whitefield, who are sometimes called the founders of the evangelical movement, argue that conversion is the experience of a new birth, a thorough change of heart and life from sin to holiness. Next in our definition is that evangelicals tend to describe their religious life as a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, there are various ways to interpret this, but this relationship could be described as evangelicals experiencing an interactive sense of God's presence. The idea that God personally prompts you to live a righteous life, or that God can speak to you in a variety of subtle ways. It's a very interactive, experiential, and relational way to think about God. Anthropologists such as Tanya Luhrmann, who spent years studying the social psychology of American evangelicals, found that they tend to emphasize that God personally communicates with them, and that they attribute certain thoughts as coming from God himself. Related to the first 2 points, evangelicals emphasize proselytizing or evangelizing others so that they can have their own born-again experiences and to enter into their own personal relationships with Jesus Christ. Evangelicals also emphasize biblicism, or what we would call regarding the Bible as God's divinely inspired word that is the final authority on everything that you should believe or practice. What this looks like on the ground is that evangelicals are much more likely to believe in biblical inerrancy compared to other Christians. The belief that the Bible is without error in all of its historical details. This leads to a high prevalence among evangelicals to believe in young earth creationism, the idea that the universe is only 6,000 years old. Now, not all evangelicals hold to biblical
Can we pause for a
inerrancy,
second?
but many will.
I thought it's super weird that they were saying only 68% of Catholics believe in evolution, when it is the official stance of the Catholic Church to believe in evolution. It's
Yeah, I
weird.
mean, when it comes to the official position of the Catholic Church and what Catholics, particularly in America, believe, I think there's a lot of divergence, especially as of late. I had I knew a guy who used to be a friend of mine. That is a bit of a sort of right-wing schizo these days. And he would talk about how, yeah, I think he's like an Eastern Orthodox or something now. One of these things where you're just like, oh, okay, you're crazy. If you're like a young white kid growing up in American suburbs or something, you're an Eastern Orthodox believer. Anyways, but he's talking about how he feels bad for like Catholics with some of the things the Pope was talking about, like accepting gay people and stuff like this. So that's actually not all that surprising to me. It's actually very similar to, if I recall correctly, that whole controversy about some of the Catholic bishops and Biden. And them thinking about rejecting him from the church and on some specific visit he was planning on doing. So there's a lot of, I think, a division inside there.
Yeah, when I hear Catholics like railing against Biden or against Democrats, though, a lot of times it's because they'll have like the conservative position on abortion or things,
Yeah.
those kind of like social issue things. But the Catholic Church, for all their conservative positions on a lot of social issues, is generally pretty good about science. Like they were one of the first churches to be on board with evolution and Big Bang theology and a lot of this stuff. So then it's like super weird to me to see Catholics like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Having these positions that their own church abandoned 50 years ago.
Still describe the Bible as authoritative or central to all beliefs and practices. And we should probably define one other term here, fundamentalism. Now, all religious traditions have some form of fundamentalism, but when it's applied to evangelicalism, we're referring to a subset of evangelicals that are even more socially and theologically strict. These are Christian groups that emphasize doctrinal purity, the idea that there are certain fundamentals of the faith that cannot be compromised, such as biblical inerrancy, and groups that emphasize separation from modernity, the idea that Christians must remove themselves from the secular world, which has resulted in various fundamentalist movements throughout the 20th century against rock music, attending movies, or dancing. Almost all fundamentalists are evangelicals, but not all evangelicals are fundamentalists. Back to you, JJ.
Thanks, Andrew. Now, for much of American history, the flavor of Christianity that Andrew was describing was quite unpopular, if not openly scorned. This was especially true among high-ranking people in government, in academia, and journalism, and even what they call the mainline Christian churches. During the late 19th and early 20th century in particular, conventional wisdom stated that America was a country in which scientific rationalism had triumphed over religious fundamentalism. The United States was still widely believed to be a Christian country, but in a more passive, abstract, cultural sort of way. People who went around talking about being born again or believing every word of the Bible or saying that God could communicate with them were seen as being very hickish and backwards. They were associated with things like the Scopes monkey trial of 1925, a very famous case that featured a fundamentalist politician arguing against the teaching of evolution in schools, which is often credited for souring much of America on evangelical Christianity for at least a generation. Anyway, for a long time, this made American evangelical Christian culture a sort of isolated underground sort of thing, a very unpopular religious minority who lived very separate and apart from mainstream America, a group who didn't really participate in politics and had their own churches and schools and radio shows. That last part is particularly important. One of the big advantages that the evangelical Christians would have when it came to staging their big comeback was the fact that many of their preachers were enormously charismatic men who were very effective communicators. Indeed, many of them literally came from a tradition known as charismatic Christianity, which, among other things, really emphasized the importance of emotionally powerful sermons that could persuade people to feel the Holy Spirit inside them. Billy Graham is the guy who is often considered the most responsible for helping burst evangelical Christianity into the American mainstream. He was an enormously charismatic preacher and radio show host who became a major American celebrity in the 1950s due to the huge success of his traveling public sermons.
Choose God, serve Him, live for Him. That is the message of God tonight to this great audience of people at Yankee Stadium.
Billy Graham's popularity made a lot of other evangelical preachers realize that they too could achieve great success by targeting larger audiences through the modern media. This led to the rise of so-called televangelism, or evangelical preachers getting their own TV shows where they could, in theory, preach to millions of Americans sitting on their couches.
There's coming a spiritual move and a revival where we will say, Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God.
God gave them the sign. Jesus said, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up.
The Bible says we are one with Him. We are one in Him. We're one spirit with the
Can we
Lord.
pause for a second?
Bone of His bone.
Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting, you know, in a couple of these other videos, we were talking about how there's like a selection pressure for people to be like more confident, you know, more extreme in their opinions, and I think that dovetails in a really interesting way with these people like being as dramatic as they are in their presentation.
100%. Sort of similar, I think we had mentioned this earlier as well, but also the idea of, you know, a pundit not being able to say, I'm not sure, because they rely on their certainty of political opinions for their work, with a pastor having a crisis of faith and not wanting to come out that and destroy their entire life. It is a really, I think, fascinating dynamic, and also I think at a certain level sad, when I think a lot of these, you know, wholesome ideas, you know, I think that Christianity does legitimately have a lot of cool, wholesome ideas, instead get hijacked by guys like this, who are like, you know, for $5.99, I'll save your soul. And it's like, Jesus, man, that just is so slimy and leaves a real bad taste in your mouth. And I know, and to their credit, I know there are a lot of Christians that look at this stuff and I just get incredibly angry and disgusted. I've got a really religious friend who's been like religion has been a huge part of his life from a very young age, and yeah, whenever we talk about this stuff, he gets like legitimately really upset because it's so obviously just a corruption and bastardization of something that should be above that kind of stuff.
Flesh of His flesh.
And when Christ changes you, everything changes. Let us pray.
All right, so what does this have to do with politics? Well, around the same time as evangelism was starting to rise as a more socially acceptable flavor of American Christianity, another very important American movement was also on the rise, the conservative movement. Like evangelical Christianity, being a right-winger in America was an identity that was long very stigmatized. It was mostly associated with people who were bigots or crackpots or basically borderline fascists. But beginning in the 1950s, there was a growing movement in some intellectual circles to rehabilitate and modernize what it meant to be on the political right. They said that this was critical in order to provide America with an alternate philosophy that could challenge the dominance of liberalism. In those days, liberalism was seen as the overwhelming ideology of the American political elite, completely dominant in both political parties. And what, you ask, was so bad about liberalism?
This post-war consensus, I think, is an often underappreciated fact in modern political life. The fact that from, you know, as early as maybe even the 30s, well into the 70s, there was a pretty dominant school of thought, particularly at the national level in American politics. Things like, JFK versus Eisenhower versus Nixon had huge differences at the time, but in terms of their baseline ideology, there was a real shared sense of, the American empire and of neoliberal capitalism would probably be the best way to describe it now. That post-war consensus was a hugely transformative time in politics, even though there wasn't much transformation at the time in terms of one to another, but the presence of having that dominant ideology was hugely transformative compared to the past, and obviously it set the foundations for what came in the future.
I would say they were kind of still living in the shadow of FDR at the time, maybe up until the Reagan era. I mean, obviously there was a lot of tumultuous stuff going on in the 1960s, but
and that's part of the reason why a lot of younger people don't appreciate or understand. That's why Reagan, especially among the older generation, is viewed so amazingly. It's not just because he was the guy that basically gave the knockout punch to the Soviet Union in a lot of people's minds, but it's also the fact that he was the first non-really liberal president we'd had in almost 50 years. When he comes in as part of the Reagan Revolution, that is the birth of the modern conservative movement we see right there. And people forget that Reagan only served 2 terms, but the immediate following term of George H.W. Bush, at the time it was almost like a second FDR, where there was just this dominant ideology that looked like couldn't be touched, especially some of those presidential elections where I think it's 84 where Reagan wins,
he won 49 states or something.
Just ridiculous margins, just total landslides. A huge and important movement. I'm sure JJ's about to get into that because it was the end of that post-war consensus.
Well, by the late 1970s, a lot of people felt that it had just failed to deliver the goods. The war in Vietnam had ended in disgrace, the Soviet Union was slowly taking over the world, Watergate had forced a criminal president out of office, and the guy who replaced him was a pathetic weakling. Violent crime had reached record levels, America's big cities had become unlivable hellholes of poverty and drugs, and high unemployment and inflation was wreaking havoc on the national economy. Basically, the country looked to be a mess, and the new conservatives, who in those days were sometimes called the neoconservatives, blamed it all on liberalism. The evangelicals, meanwhile, reached the same conclusions, but for different reasons. They saw American decline as a symptom of a ruling class that had abandoned biblical values in favor of a destructive new doctrine that they called secular humanism. They agreed with the neoconservatives about poverty and crime and drugs and the Soviet Union and all the rest, but also focused on a few unique issues as well. These included the breakdown of the traditional biblically ordained family structure, which they saw evidenced through growing acceptance of divorce and promiscuity and homosexuality, the rise of feminism, which they saw as encouraging women to abandon their traditional roles as wives and mothers, and thus break down the traditional family structure even further.
The biblical family structure thing is always such a funny talking point, considering when you look at what the families were like in the Bible, they were huge extended families. A lot of them were practicing polygamy. I don't know.
The real traditional, the nuclear family is, depending upon where you're at in the world, particularly in America, is a much more modern thing. These sort of tribal extended families are much more traditional, and you still see that in ethnic communities, for example, where there's 2 or 3 households that kids are in, there's a bunch of different cousins and uncles and stuff that, it very much form a village it takes a village to raise a child. They very much form almost a village in of themselves in the family unit. That's a huge sort of misnomer in terms of what a traditional family actually looks like.
Yeah, and you would think if you're the kind of conservative that wants to preserve the type of values in society that got us to where we're at now. I mean, maybe it's not commonplace in 1970s America as much, but it's it's kind of the foundation that liberalism sprouted from and has mostly thrived in. Then you would think. That's probably closer to what you should be pushing for than this more relatively recent leave it to beaver ideal of the family.
Yeah, I think it just sort of speaks to the ways in which people will adapt a religion to their culture and their community. It's kind of like the different depictions of Jesus in different cultures. You know, you grow up as a Christian in a community that is like suburban based, very much all about the nuclear family, that it's no surprise that you sort of try to incorporate those two in a fusion for yourself that looks very different to then what like Christianity looks like in radically different places.
The legalization of abortion in all 50 states following the famous Roe v. Wade Supreme Court ruling of 1973. Many evangelicals saw this as basically legalizing murder, since they believe that God creates life at the moment of conception. And in general, there was just a lot of frustration at the increasing secularization of American life, in which once perfectly mainstream Christian traditions, like teachers leading their students in prayer, were suddenly being eliminated or even made illegal by a government seen as being hostile to religion. What the evangelical and neoconservative leaders had in common was a shared belief that America was being led down a path to ruin by a liberal elite that was grossly out of touch with what most normal Americans actually wanted. This was made particularly explicit in 1979 when a guy named Jerry Falwell Sr., a popular televangelist, formed a political activism group called the Moral Majority. Falwell's theory of politics was that even if most Americans were not themselves evangelical Christians, they were a lot closer to their beliefs than the beliefs of the secular humanist liberals who had amassed so much power in Washington, D.C. In 1980, the former Republican governor of California, Ronald Wilson Reagan, was elected president of the United States. It was a remarkable turnaround for a man who just a decade earlier had been quite widely written off as being too right-wing to have any sort of future in American politics. Reagan was a born-again Christian, and although a lot of people would say he was never all that religiously sophisticated, he was very captivated by the arguments of the evangelical Christians, which aligned very closely with his own conservative beliefs. He became good buddies with Jerry Falwell and many of the other top evangelical leaders of the time, and it was through this alliance that the modern transformation of the Republican Party began. During his presidential campaign, Reagan had this one very famous moment where he addressed this big gathering of evangelicals and gave one of his trademark Reagan quips.
A few days ago, I addressed a group in Chicago and received their endorsement for my candidacy. Now, I know this is a nonpartisan gathering, and so I know that you can't endorse me, but I only brought that up because I want you to know that I endorse you and what you are doing.
Now, as a purely strategic alliance, this was genius. Evangelical Christians, though only a small group of Americans overall, made for fantastic political allies for two main reasons. A, they were very loyal to their leaders, who had a broad reach through television and their activist groups. And B, they were highly motivated to vote, because of course they were animated by a sense of religious obligation, which can make a big difference in a country where most people can barely be motivated to vote at all. So Reagan won the Republican nomination and then the presidency, winning a massive 75% of the white evangelical vote in the process. And as everybody knows, Reagan proceeded to lead a very conservative administration during his 8 years in the White House. To varying degrees of success, his government prioritized addressing all of the anxieties of the 1970s, including crime, drugs, economic malaise, and international communism. Under Reagan, the Republicans also took a sharply adversarial position towards the legal status of abortion, at one point even promising to amend the US Constitution to outlaw it. In 1985, the Reagan administration formally requested that the US Supreme Court overturn the Roe v. Wade ruling. And then in 1986, the Supreme Court only very narrowly voted to uphold it in a 5-4 decision. The narrowness of that loss then gave rise to a popular trope among evangelicals that if they could just get one more judge appointed to the US Supreme Court, the battle against legal abortion could be finally won. But in many ways, the most important legacy
and a couple of years after his saying that, that's exactly what happened.
Yep. And they didn't just get one more judge. They got more than that.
The mainstreaming of this general philosophy that government power was something inherently bad to be forever on guard against. Big government was cast as a force fundamentally threatening to the beliefs and traditions of the American family, which meant that it should get out of their lives as much as possible. So everything from low taxes to gun rights to homeschooling should be supported because they all contributed to the fundamental goal of a small, non-invasive government. For most of his 2 terms, President Reagan was very popular, which helped validate his alliance with the evangelicals, as well as reinforce one of their big arguments about America, namely that it was a much more conservative country than the liberal elites of the previous generation had assumed. Certainly, if you look at public opinion polls from the Reagan years, you can find plenty of evidence that Americans from the 1980s did indeed have rather conservative views on things like abortion and sex and LGBT rights and the problems of the country in general. For a while, it seemed like the evangelicals were really on an ascendancy. In fact, at one time, one of the most popular candidates to succeed President Reagan was Pat Robertson, a very famous televangelist of the time. But by the late 1980s, public opinion was starting to slowly turn against the evangelicals. One problem was that some of the top evangelical leaders had basically become too successful for their own good. The traditional televangelist business model relied on public donations for funding, but as the years went on, it was starting to look like a lot of these guys were raising way more money than they actually needed. The 1980s saw a massive explosion of evangelical TV stations and universities and charities and hospitals and even theme parks, all funded mostly by public donations. This allowed many evangelical leaders to amass a great deal of wealth and power, yet they kept asking for even more money and were seen as relying on increasingly manipulative tactics to get it.
I need some very quick money, so I'll know when March comes, I won't be taken. I'll get to live.
Then came a number of huge scandals which toppled some of the top televangelists of the time and really captured the nation's attention. Among other sensationalistic stories, the famous TV preacher Jimmy Swaggart was revealed to have repeatedly solicited prostitutes.
I have sinned against you, my Lord.
While the equally famous Jim Bakker was revealed to both be cheating on his wife and diverting money from his ministry in order to fund his cartoonishly lavish lifestyle.
Jim Bakker was found guilty on all 24 counts of wire and mail fraud and conspiracy.
So Pat Robertson's presidential campaign wound up going nowhere, and American politics in the 1990s was defined not by perpetual Reaganism, but by the liberal boomerism of Bill Clinton. It was a grim setback, but the evangelicals would get their second act soon enough. So the second great era of evangelical political power in the United States occurred between the years 2001 and 2008 under the presidency of George W. Bush. Now, Bush was another born-again Christian, but unlike Reagan, he wasn't much of a political pioneer. Elected as the Republican governor of Texas in 1994, he was part of a big wave of post-Reagan evangelical politicians getting elected to high office in their own right, rather than merely relying on evangelical votes. And if the evangelical politics of the 1980s were fresh and experimental, the presidency of George W. Bush in the early 2000s represented their professionalization. By this time...
One thing that always strikes me when I watch this video, I watched it a couple of times, is how short political windows really are. You know, if you think about the idea of evangelicals in America, that's a huge political movement, right? It's like one of the most important ones and big and important. But if you really think about it, they've had like technically three presidencies. They had Reagan plus Bush Sr.'s single term, and then they had W, which obviously blew up in flames. And it's kind of wild to sit back and be like, wait a minute, they only got like really two presidencies. That's actually really crazy how small the window truly is sometimes for political winds to change. And it's something that I think is something that you should bear in mind. Just thinking about sort of the time I most applied this was there's a lot of arguments talking about, oh, what DeSantis should do is he shouldn't run against Trump in 24. He should wait for 28. Because if Trump loses in 24, he'll be gone for sure. And if he wins in 24, he can't run for re-election. So it's a genius to wait for 28. And man, I don't know about you, but I think that's an awful idea because DeSantis' window where he is going to be a national, popular public figure, that's not going to last forever. And it's already hitting now. I mean, just look at how much people have soured on Trump since 2016 in these 8 years. And now DeSantis is going to have to roll the dice to see if he's still going to be relevant going into 2028. And who knows what the political landscape looks like then. If DeSantis wants to become president, he'll go now. Trump be damned, and he'll make his play for the throne. It's I'm reminded of Chris Christie, who once seemed like he was going to be the next big Republican. Now, is totally irrelevant in the shape of the party, at least for now.
So on the one hand, sure, these things are a little bit ephemeral. Their time in the sun is short-lived, and nevertheless, this is still one of the most successful political movements in the history of the world. So it's just that, like, I guess this is just the fate of all political movements. I
guess the biggest takeaway is how fragile even the biggest political movements are. Because evangelicals are absolutely huge, and even still, they've only gotten really 2.5 presidencies before it all blows up in their face, and then Trump, that's a whole nother can of worms. So yeah, it's really crazy how quickly things can change. And I think people really underestimate sometimes how much you can change. Politics can change, and you can be a part of that change.
Evangelical Christian culture had emerged as an increasingly visible force in American pop culture and media. Televangelism had declined quite a bit, but in its place, we got things like evangelical Christian novels and movies and rock music and even video games. At the political level, meanwhile, a large and sophisticated network of evangelical Christian politicians and advisors and activists and lobbyists helped make the Republican Party much more serious and businesslike about focusing on a few core religiously inspired priorities. First was abortion, which was an issue that proved to have continuing resonance in a way that some of the earlier stuff about, say, feminism or prayer in schools had not. Now, the fact that abortion has wound up as one of the defining issues of American Christian conservatives is a kind of uniquely American thing, and there's a number of theories as to why this is. One is that it is a testament to the American melting pot. In a lot of other countries, being very anti-abortion is considered a very Catholic thing, with other types of Christian being more liberal on the issue. And it was that way in America for quite a while as well. But because America is this big, diverse society in which a lot of different types of people all intermingle and influence one another, a lot of conservative Catholics would say that their arguments on abortion ultimately persuaded America's Protestant evangelicals. Others would say that the whole Roe v. Wade ruling, which recognized abortion as a fundamental constitutional right, was a lot more extreme and dramatic than anything that ever happened in Europe, for example, which made some sort of pushback inevitable. Even some prominent liberal judges sometimes make this argument.
I thought Roe v. Wade was an easy case, and the Supreme Court could have held that most extreme law unconstitutional and put down its pen. Instead, the court wrote an opinion that made every abortion restriction in the country illegal in one fell swoop. And that was not the way that the court ordinarily operates.
And then there's the fact that American women were just having a lot of abortions.
Interesting to hear Ruth Bader Ginsburg say that.
It really gets into the actual arguments around Roe versus Wade in terms of the constitutionality of sort of investigating the doctors and the privacy sort of protections that you would have from such investigations are really interesting. They're totally distinct from the actual conversation on abortion as to whether or not it is murder. But it's a whole sort of separate rabbit hole that is really interesting. I highly encourage anyone who's interested in that sort of the sort of technicals of those arguments to go down, because it is entirely distinct from the question of whether or not a fetus is alive or not.
Yeah, you and I did an episode one time about the kind of legal questions around Roe versus Wade. We were reviewing a debate between Pisco and Lactoid. But we have yet to actually touch on any of the moral arguments for or against abortion.
Yeah.
compared to other Western countries like Britain or France. And whatever the socioeconomic reasons for why that was happening, it did give the issue a lot of ongoing resonance in the US that it didn't have in other places. The second big issue was gay rights. In the early 2000s, courts around the United States began to rule that same-sex couples had the right to marry. It was a very unpopular idea with the general public, and especially evangelicals, who, as we said, were very defensive about the traditional biblically ordained family structure. President Bush, in turn, moved quickly to make opposition to gay marriage a big part of his political brand, even backing a constitutional amendment to ban same-sex marriage in all 50 states.
If judges insist on forcing their arbitrary will upon the people, the only alternative left to the people would be the constitutional process. Our nation must defend the sanctity of marriage.
This hostility to gay marriage is often credited with helping him win a narrow re-election in 2004, at a time in which he was otherwise fairly unpopular. And then the third leg of the stool was foreign policy, a realm that had long served as a great rallying cry for conservatives of all stripes. Ronald Reagan had said that the dominant geopolitical challenge facing the world was the growth of Soviet-backed communist regimes. He was hardly the first president to do so, of course, but Reagan was famous for framing the Cold War in starkly moral terms, which many evangelicals found quite attractive.
There is sin and evil in the world, and we're enjoined by Scripture and the Lord Jesus to oppose it with all our might. To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil. I ask you to resist the attempts.
Since the USSR was officially atheist, the spread of
Can we pause for a
communism
second?
could be seen as something.
Yeah.
This kind of moralizing that Reagan does is, I think, is really it's hard for me to separate that from the way that the right wing was able to justify doing a lot of immoral stuff under Reagan's administration, especially if you look at their like Latin American interventions. And
Yeah, I mean, it's a dangerous road to go down when you frame a conflict as a deeply moral struggle or a deeply important struggle, because you can start to justify all sorts of crazy things. And maybe that is the case. I personally am of the opinion that, sometimes sometimes the ends do justify the means. I think, for example, if you look at World War II, the draft. I think the draft is one of the most evil violations of individual rights. The government not only kidnaps you, but also sends you in certain circumstances to your certain death. How many of the people that were drafted were on the beaches of D-Day that were basically just funneled into a meat grinder for a tactical advantage? I think something like that is deeply, deeply immoral. But man, when it's the United States versus the Third Reich, I think I'm on board with the draft being employed there. You gotta be really careful, because when you start to engage in that kind of stuff, obviously, speaking of World War II, one of the greatest examples would be, if you think that, for example, Jews are evil, then you might be willing to justify some absolutely crazy shit like many Germans did with the Holocaust. So you have to be really, really careful engaging in these kinds of ideological justifications, because you can get to really dangerous places. It's part of the reason why a healthy dose of skepticism can be really important, because if you're skeptical about, whether or not Jews are or are not evil, that's going to significantly degrade your willingness to go through with something like the Holocaust, because you might be uncertain about whether or not Jews are human, but you're not uncertain about whether or not the Holocaust is going to kill them. So when you frame it in those terms, that's a dose of reality that can help lead people away from some of the worst acts that human beings are capable of, with the sort of industrialized mass murder that nations are now capable of.
I think one thing that a lot of the worst people in history all seem to have in common is like this lack of epistemic humility, right? It's just this like fanaticism about whatever it is that they believe, and whoever's against them must be evil, and therefore we can justify doing terrible things.
Yeah, and it's a very dangerous road to go down. It's something you got to be really careful. I think especially because the other part of this conversation that I feel like often gets missed, and something I harp on a lot, is it seems like there is a willingness among people who are like, you can do a right thing you can do a wrong thing to do a right. There's a a tendency among those kinds of people to almost be looking for an excuse sometimes, where if you're constantly thinking, oh, I totally would do a bad thing to do a good thing, you might that might actually start affecting the lenses by which you analyze the situation to see if there is something bad to do something good. You might start underestimating how bad the bad thing you're doing is and overestimating the good that you're causing, such that, even if we agree with the principle, you're not even applying the principle because you're actually doing more harm than good. But because you're almost so hungry to be like, yeah, I'll make the hard decision, it almost leads to like a weakness. I'm reminded of, I don't know if you've seen A Few Good Men.
No, I haven't.
It's the famous movie where Jack Nicholson is the Marine commander.
It's the You Can't
and
Handle
Tom
the
Cruise
Truth.
is the lawyer. Yeah, You Can't Handle the Truth. And it's funny because maybe this is just my takeaway. I don't know if other people agree with this or not. But always watching that movie is that Jack Nicholson is fundamentally right in the sense of you need to sometimes the military sometimes needs to do things that are bad in order to protect the country, right? Like the draft, right? Or engaging in any form of warfare, there's going to be civilian casualties no matter what you do, right? Deciding to invade Nazi Germany was morally right, but that carries with it the knowledge that you're going to kill some civilians along the way. Where he's wrong is he gets caught up in this like emotional, almost like toxic masculine bravado about like, yeah, I am willing to do the really hard thing, such that he starts acting callously and without actually analyzing whether or not this bad thing is worth the good. And tragically leads to the death of one of his Marines, which is sort of what the whole trial is based around.
A really unfortunate feature of human psychology is that once you recognize something, it's hard to like not think of that thing as characteristic of the category that you're putting it in, right? So if you think like, yes, there are times when two wrongs do make a right, or whatever it is, like when you have to commit violence to for the greater good, it's then a real challenge to think of that as the rare exception and not to just want to apply it to every single time that an opportunity comes up where you could do violence and you could justify it for a greater good.
It's a lot like in academic circles, people will talk about different things being lenses as opposed to the way the world is. This is a lens that works in certain situations. But people, when they get an idea, they just become convinced, oh, this is the idea that solves everything. It's almost like, in Twitch politics, I think, I forget who said this sometimes, but it's like, oh, how convenient. This problem also happens to be solved by my pet ideology. What a crazy coincidence that this pet ideology I have just has to be the solution to everything.
It seems to be the way that very ideologically motivated people just think across the board. It's like, once they become enamored with their one frame of reference for the world, now they just have to apply it to every single thing at the expense of any other ways of analyzing the same issues.
Agreed.
That was deeply anti-Christian and anti-God, as well as just a vision of the sort of totalitarian nightmare society that a powerful left-wing government could impose. The USSR was long gone by the time George W. Bush came along, but a new totalitarian ideology was quickly regarded as the successor threat, the Islamic extremism of terrorists like Osama bin Laden. Like communism, bin Ladenism was an ideology that fantasized about a world without Christians, and was thus one that American evangelicals felt great personal imperative to help stop. And like Reagan, Bush was not shy about framing America's post-9/11 war against Islamic fundamentalism in starkly moral terms, including in one very infamous moment that he never quite lived down.
And this is a new kind of evil, and we understand, and the American people are beginning to understand. Now, this crusade, this war on terrorism.
The war on Middle Eastern terrorism also provided President Bush with an opportunity to strengthen America's alliance with the nation of Israel. This, too, was often framed in deeply moral terms that had particular resonance with evangelicals. The Bible contains many references to the Jews as God's chosen people, with a divine claim to a government in and around Jerusalem. More controversially, some evangelicals even believe that the existence of the State of Israel is a necessary precondition to the second coming of Christ.
this is the place where God and Satan are on a square off, because this is the turf. In other words, this is the playing field. The playing field isn't in Ethiopia. It's not in Washington, D.C. It's in Jerusalem. That's the city.
Either way, continuing to defend and strengthen the American-Israeli partnership became a powerful unifying issue to conservatives of all sorts, as it remains today. But that conservative unity also brings up an important point. One of the key lessons of the Reagan and George W. Bush presidencies is that evangelical Christians had the most influence when they were supporting positions that other, more secular conservatives supported as well. I mean, I don't want to give the impression that evangelical Christians were like the only driving force in the modern American conservative movement. Certainly stuff like conservative talk radio and Fox News, and magazines like National Review, and websites like Breitbart were very influential as well. And they existed very much apart from the evangelical subculture, even if they supported a lot of the same things. But all of this overlap also begged an important question. Were the evangelicals actually changing the morals of America? Or were they simply providing a religious rationalization for a lot of things Americans wanted to do anyway? Which brings us to the present day.
And by present day, he means 2018.
Yep.
Since the age of Reagan and even the age of Bush. By every conceivable measurement, the country is a lot less religious, with much more liberal attitudes towards things like marriage, sex, gender roles, and LGBT rights. Not abortion, though, interestingly enough. A common line you sometimes...
Oh, never mind. This video might be more recent.
Is that
I think I was
even
mixing
though
it up.
evangelicals
One of the other ones was 2018.
No, yeah, I don't think it's 2018, but I do think it's still a couple of years ago. Yeah, 2020.
Okay.
Have been very successful in politics, they have been vastly less successful in every other realm of American life, including education, journalism, and entertainment. They have won many elections, but lost the culture. And this being the case, I would say that a lot of evangelicals now have an increasingly minoritarian view of themselves. This would be the idea that evangelicals have basically given up the dream that their views represent something close to the mainstream of American popular opinion, and instead once again conceptualize themselves as a small and unpopular minority that primarily needs government to protect them from a hostile majority culture. This is why the concept...
This is very... I was going to say very reminiscent, but it's not reminiscent. You can still see this in a lot of different sort of trains of political thought, especially on the right wing of sometimes this sort of like almost like doomerist, like black pill take that like, oh, we'll never get the votes enough to like actually control America. We just need to, break through in one key election and then entrench a bunch of power and stuff like this. There's a Nick Fuentes clip that was circulating, I think, on the Destiny subreddit just a couple days ago that I watched that was essentially talking about, the need to win one election or, it's done. And that the idea that most of the country is fundamentally like evil or against them. It is a sentiment that you see a lot in on the right when you traditionally didn't. But you do see, not just on the right, but in a lot of different places. It feels like there's a lot of different groups that there's a lot of different sort of groups where it feels like none of them are in control and they're all afraid of being victimized by the other. Where you see, like, for example, like African Americans, there's still a great concern about persecution from police. Republicans feel like, they're going to get canceled. Their jobs are going to get taken away from them. Liberals are worried about, like the fascist uprising of the right taking over the country. It feels like every group is in a seemingly every group perceives themselves to be in a precarious position. And that really can drive a lot of the sort of worst emotional excesses of like human tribalism.
Yeah, I pretty much agree that attitude is very widespread and prevalent. And then the thing about like them wanting to just seize a little bit of power and entrench it is where the conservatives have been actually pretty successful. And I think the Supreme Court is Exhibit A for that.
Yeah, like JJ talks about just a moment ago. I mean, they have had a lot of political successes but lost the culture. And when you have that big imbalance, you get a lot of friction, when it's the case that, the court is looking at far more conservative than the country is. That is the kind of thing where that can really start to generate a lot of resentment and create a crisis of confidence. Excuse me. Can create a crisis of confidence. This is what Pisco talked about in regards to the abortion decision. is that there's a really good reason why the court doesn't go back and forth on big decisions like this, because it undermines the institution, and they're really starting to get at that with the conservative decisions that they're coming out with.
Of religious liberty has become such a popular slogan in the evangelical political movement. This refers to the idea that even if American culture is broadly hostile to the evangelicals, they should still be able to operate their schools and charities and businesses according to their religious beliefs. One of the most famous recent episodes in this regard was the case of the Colorado baker who didn't want to make a wedding cake for a gay couple, if you remember that story. Protecting the rights of people like that baker is the sort of thing that evangelicals now spend a lot of time worrying about, and it is one of the reasons why there is so much focus on President Trump appointing good conservative judges. Abortion remains the other big moral issue that is still being actively fought. This reflects the fact that American public opinion on this issue hasn't moved all that much since the 1970s. Accordingly, the evangelical mantra of just one more judge on the U.S. Supreme Court has remained popular throughout the Trump years. Yet that being said, the Supreme Court already has a pretty solid majority of judges appointed by Republican presidents at this point, and Roe v. Wade still seems pretty far from being overturned anytime soon. Most credit
that
to
didn't
the
age well.
idea that American judges are very deferential to the concept of precedent, and Roe v. Wade has been precedent in America for close to a half century now. Just a few
In JJ's defense, there was a real strain of thought that held that Roe v. Wade might be upheld by the conservative court even after all of Trump's appointments, just because there was such a precedence for it. David French, I think, talked about this for a bit, talking about how it seemed like the core of defending the concept of Roe was a much harsher, like 6-3 majority in favor of upholding, as opposed to the very rigid conservative opinion. That it was looking more like it was like a 3-3-3 court as opposed to like a 6-3 court.
weeks ago, in fact, there was a major Supreme Court ruling that struck down mere anti-abortion regulations. That ruling was 5-4, but as the anti-abortion evangelical political commentator David French noted, when you look closely
I think I'm just referencing the exact thing he's about to bring up. Whoops.
at the ruling, you will find that the size of the majority supporting the core of the abortion right is more like 8-1. Stricter abortion regulations may be within reach if the Republicans appoint one more judge, but that's a pretty watered down goal compared to the 1980s, in which outlawing legal abortion altogether seemed within reach. But overall, when we talk about the role played by evangelical Christians in American politics today, we are less likely to talk about specific policy goals than just their incredibly fierce personal loyalty to President Trump himself. At a time when the president is increasingly unpopular, evangelical Christians are the faction of the electorate that is the most doggedly loyal to him, as I explained at the beginning of this video. Initially, the argument that you often heard was that evangelical Christians were only begrudging supporters of Trump. They knew he was not much of a Christian, but they threw their support behind him anyway, in this narrowly transactional way, because they knew he had their back on the issues that mattered the most to them, like abortion and religious liberty.
We're not electing a pastor-in-chief, we're electing a commander-in-chief, and we can't expect our commander-in-chief to have the same qualities as our pastors. And I think most of the rank-and-file evangelicals have figured that out on their own.
But on the other hand, political pragmatism does not explain why white evangelicals are so overwhelmingly likely to call President Trump intelligent or honest or morally upstanding, or why they tend to be such rock-solid supporters of aspects of his political agenda that have no obvious connection to the evangelical view of the world, like his border security stuff or his management of the COVID situation, which gets to the big conclusion of this story. For 40 years,
Seems like
America's
a halo
evangelical
effect
Christians
is a pretty
have
obvious explanation for that, right? Like once somebody gets you on their side, you're likely to just continue supporting it, whatever they're,
Yeah, but I think the sort of point that JJ is making is that sort of would imply that there's not this very sort of transactional, that evangelicals don't view Trump as, a bad person but a good president, but a good person and a good president.
Yeah. It's like genuinely challenging, I think, for people to even have like that level of nuance about the people they support. It's just like I don't know. It's just a very unfortunate thing, I think, to have such a black and white view of like the world just has good people and bad people or something. I don't know.
Interwoven themselves with the Republican Party. This has given them unprecedented power and influence, but has also made it increasingly difficult to separate their religious identity from their political identity. The question becomes, to what extent are the political opinions of evangelical Christians motivated by their faith, versus to what degree has their faith merely become an expression of their politics? What do you think?
Well, what do you think?
Yeah, I think my take is a very similar one, that it seems like, your ideas, be they political or religious, are going to be very socially and culturally informed based off of the kind of person you are. They're going to be woven together. And when you start to weave together, the Republican Party's conservatism with your evangelicalism, it's no surprise that you see a corruption of both by the other. That ideas that you should be, that principled conservative ideas that clash with evangelical ones, get left by the wayside, and some more principled evangelical positions that clash with conservative ones also get left by the wayside. And as a result, both sort of end up being corrupted into lesser forms of themselves. But for all that being said, I mean, it sure was it was a hell of a political efficacy. If you look at the gains, I mean, there's no contesting the fact that as a political strategy, it worked.
Yeah, I mean, political alliances are costly to, if in terms of ideological purity, they're very costly, but just in terms of political efficacy, they're the dominant strategy, basically.
Yeah. I think it also speaks to the fact that you never get to do things in a vacuum. In a vacuum, let's just vote together. Works great. But in the real world, things play out based off of incentives and structures that affect people. And you start to see that, if you try to start lumping them together to vote together, there's going to be a cultural cross-contamination. And that's going to then have effects on the culture, which then can form new ideas going forward. And sure, this might be good now, but what about the resentment it generates towards Christianity by getting involved in cultural wars? And how is that going to swing back in 40 years, right? We talk about 1980, Reagan's first election, to 2020 now. Sounds like a long time, you say it in 40 years, but then you remember, that's only a handful of presidencies, right? There's only been, 2-3 really Republican presidencies, again, discounting the single term of George Bush Sr. It's so difficult to try and predict the future accurately and be cognizant of those, because they can just run to such places you'd never predict in the first place.
Essentially, we're dealing with chaotic systems with lots of unpredictable actors and lots of unpredictable inputs influencing those actors, and so I think it's effectively impossible to actually figure out like how are people going to respond to these things. And I think all we can do is take our best guesses and then accidentally look really smart when we get it right.
Yeah, you've gotta decrease your confidence. I mean, I know there's a lot of people talking about the red wave of 2022. Same people who thought Biden was going to get crushed because he was Hillary 2.0. You don't hear much about that anymore. You got to be, and just on the other foot, I mean, Hillary Clinton guaranteed win. No way Trump could win. You've got to decrease your confidence in these things and scale back how far ahead you're willing to look, because politics is a quick and dynamic game, and you'd be surprised how quickly you can end up on your ass.
Yeah, and to the examples that you were talking about, I think people would generally do better to take a really broad view of the evidence of which comparisons they're willing to make, rather than just make one recent salient comparison and just say like this one is so overwhelmingly convincing despite having a sample size of only one. Like it must be that the next similar example will go the same way, even though many others didn't, if you were to take a broader view of similar circumstances. Yeah.
Like almost every political issue, it seems these days, it's all about, a healthy appreciation for statistics and probabilities.
So, hey, I was remembering what earlier on, something that I wanted to ask you about, which is like last week when you were here, there was like some panel that you were going to do last week. I haven't watched it yet, but you had like some interesting things to say about like they were structuring it in an unusual way, and so I wanted to ask you, like, how did that go?
Oh yeah, it went pretty nice. It was I think his name is F-Bomb on Twitch. Basically, the idea was he was asking us some pretty, hilarious questions. Like, given that abortion has women have gotten the right to abortion, should we even the scales by taking away the right for women to vote or something like this? Just like ludicrous questions and stuff. And then everyone was playing a political character. I played Johnny Venture Capital Seed, Johnny Appleseed's great descendant, who is all about crypto and Elon. Stuff like that. Yeah, it was a short but little sweet fun thing. He does it quite a bit from what I understand. So if that sounds interesting to people, I recommend you go check him out.
Yeah, I would like to watch that, and I haven't yet, but I know like Twitch only saves videos for a week, so I should really go watch that today, because I think it was last Thursday, if I recall. So anybody that wants to watch that, get on it. Well, you want to shout yourself out, your social media and stuff?
Yeah. What's up, guys? My name's Flowtrace, twitch.tv/Flowtrace, twitter.com/Flowtrace. I am working on getting my streaming setup worked. I have ordered a camera. I'm committing to that, and a new computer as well, because I've gotten a lot of mileage out of, my old computer here, but I think I've had this now for like 12 years or something ridiculous. So yeah. The other thing I would do is if any of you out there want to get involved in politics, want to make a difference in the world, there is a canvassing organization going on for Georgia. Destiny is getting canvassing together for the first weekend of December. Let me just check my calendar here, what days those are. Yeah, December 3rd and 4th. It's going to be canvassing in Georgia. There's a post on the subreddit if you want to get involved, if you are nearby. There's carpooling going on as well. I'm going to be traveling there from the West Coast. Fingers crossed, everything goes well there. I'm hoping to make the very long journey from where I'm at. If you are looking to get politically involved, it's going to be a fun time, and we're going to get a bunch of great political canvassing done. So highly recommend that to anybody who can make it.
Okay, sorry, when is that you're going to be doing that?
It's going to be the first weekend of December 3rd and 4th in the state of Georgia.
Okay. I that makes me think that maybe we should do a show about that week, because I bet you'll probably have a lot to say having done that.
Yeah, probably. I don't know if I would be able to do the weekend or the Wednesday before the 30th of November versus the 7th of December, just because I think I'm going to be like out of town with Thanksgiving stuff. But we should definitely touch bases when I have my schedule locked in I still haven't ordered my plane ticket yet. I'm looking around trying to find the best possible deal for, some awful 9-hour flight with connecting stuff on some godforsaken airline. But point is, you're 100% right. We should try and do something with it.
Yeah, I would love to hear about it. All right, well, I think that's about it for today. Thank you for joining us, and I'll be raiding out in just a minute.
All right.